The yellowed plastic clock above the kitchen sink hummed, its second hand hitching slightly every time it passed the 9. It was 1:47 a.m. Eleni stood with her forearms submerged in lukewarm gray water. A thick layer of grease from the roasted lamb had congealed along the rim of the double-basined stainless steel sink, forming a pale, waxy ring that resisted the cheap, lemon-scented detergent. Her spine felt compressed, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from her lower lumbar down to her right heel. The physical tax of a 10-hour shift managing the billing desk at the physical therapy clinic, followed by 4 hours of organizing her father's chaotic business receipts on the dining room table. Upstairs, the house was mostly dark, but the floorboards occasionally groaned as her sister, Sophia, tossed in her sleep. Sophia's room was the largest in the house, currently crowded with garment bags, silver-trimmed shoeboxes, and 3 separate tiers of white tulle draped over the curtain rods like sleeping ghosts. The door to the hallway creaked open. Eleni didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of her mother's footsteps, the soft, dragging slide of worn velvet slippers. Maria entered the kitchen without looking at her eldest daughter. She walked straight to the stovetop, where a small stainless steel pot of leftover chamomile tea sat cold. She picked up a wooden spoon, ran a finger over the dry rim, and then looked toward the window. "The Vardas family is used to a certain standard," Maria said, her voice low, flat, and carrying the heavy, rhythmic cadence of her native village. "Mrs. Vardas called me after they got home. She was polite, very polite, but she mentioned the table settings tonight. She said back in Greece, even the poorest families find a way to put silver-plated chargers under the plates for the engagement dinner. She said it keeps the heat in the food." Eleni didn't stop scrubbing. The yellow sponge rasped against the stoneware. "The engagement dinner was at a restaurant, Ma. We didn't choose the plates." "We chose the package," Maria corrected softly. She picked up a clean mug from the drying rack, examined it for water spots under the harsh, fluorescent ceiling light, and set it down with a sharp clack on the laminate countertop. "If we had paid the extra $8 a head, they would have used the premium settings. Now Mrs. Vardas thinks we are cheap. She thinks we are trying to hide something." Eleni's mind immediately began the calculation. $8 a head, 85 guests at the engagement dinner, $680, plus tax and the mandatory 20% gratuity for the service staff. $816 total. $816 was exactly the cost of the front brake pads and rotors her Honda Civic desperately needed. For 3 weeks, every time she pressed the pedal, she heard a dry, metallic screech that made her grip the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She let the silence stretch. In the old days, she would have explained the math. She would have pulled out the ledger, the thick, blue-covered notebook where she tracked every dollar that left her account to fund Sophia's 6-figure dream. She would have shown her mother the balance sheets, the dwindling savings, the credit card limits creeping closer to their ceiling. Tonight, she simply squeezed the sponge. A stream of greasy, lukewarm water trickled down her wrist, disappearing into the sleeve of her oversized gray sweater. "I'm speaking to you, Eleni," Maria said, her tone shifting slightly, adopting that soft, bruised quality she used whenever she felt ignored. "Your father worked 12 hours today at the shop. His knees are swollen like melons. He doesn't need to hear that his eldest daughter is ignoring her mother over a few plates." "I hear you, Ma," Eleni said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the defensive heat that used to rise in her throat. "We have to look right," Maria continued, turning her back to Eleni to search the cabinet for the honey jar. "If the Vardas family thinks we are struggling, they will look down on Sophia. You want your sister to be happy, don't you? You want her to start her life with her head held high? Maria's hand hovered over a jar of organic wild clover honey on the second shelf, the expensive kind Sophia insisted on for her morning tea. Maria tried to twist the lid, but her grip, slick with hand cream, slipped. She let out a small, dramatic sigh of frustration and remained standing with her back to the kitchen, the jar held loosely in her hand. It was a silent command. Eleni dried her hands on a damp kitchen towel that smelled faintly of old bleach. She stepped over, took the jar from her mother's hands, twisted the sticky metal lid until the vacuum seal popped with a dull thunk, and handed it back. "The florist called today," Eleni said, her voice dropping into the quiet rhythm of the room. "The deposit for the floral arch is due by Friday. It's $4,200. "Sophia wants the white hydrangeas," Maria said instantly, her eyes bright and defensive as she dipped a spoon into the amber honey. "She's wanted them since she was a little girl. You know this." "The hydrangeas are out of season," Eleni said. "That's why they're $4,000. If we use the standard white roses, it's $1,200. Maria stopped stirring her tea. She looked at Eleni, her eyes narrowing slightly, her expression hardening into that familiar look of deep, ancestral disappointment. "Roses are common, Eleni. Every girl in this neighborhood has roses. The Vardas family, their oldest son married a girl from Astoria who had orchids flown in from Hawaii. Do you want Sophia's mother-in-law to sit there and compare her to a girl who had orchids while we couldn't even manage hydrangeas?" Eleni looked down at the dark pools of tea in her mother's mug. She calculated the energy required to explain that the flower budget had already exceeded the original estimate by 300%. She calculated the emotional cost of the tears Sophia would cry tomorrow morning if she suggested the roses, the dramatic slamming of doors, the accusations that Eleni was ruining her life because of her own bitter jealousy. "I'll transfer the money tomorrow," Eleni said quietly. "Good," Maria said, her face instantly relaxing back into its mask of mild, maternal fatigue. She took a slow sip of her tea, her eyes drifting toward the window that looked out onto the dark, narrow driveway. "And the chargers? For the main reception? You'll call the coordinator?" "I'll call them," Eleni said. Maria nodded once, apparently satisfied, and walked out of the kitchen. She didn't offer to dry a single plate. She didn't thank Eleni for the honey, or for the $4,000, or for the $800 she had just agreed to subtract from her own safety net. The door clicked shut behind her. Eleni stood alone in the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder in the absence of her mother's voice. She reached down, pulled the rubber stopper from the sink drain, and watched the greasy, gray water slowly vortex away, leaving behind a thick residue of fat and food particles clinging to the stainless steel. She didn't clean the sink. She simply left the sponge damp on the divider, turned off the overhead light, and walked into the dark living room. On the coffee table sat Sophia's wedding planner, a thick white leather binder with "The Future Mrs. Vardas" embossed in gold leaf on the cover. Next to it was Eleni's personal laptop, its screen still glowing faintly in the dark. Eleni sat on the edge of the sofa. She opened her online banking portal. Checking account, $1,420.15. Savings account, $340.08. Unsecured line of credit, $18,500. Balance, $17,200. She looked at the numbers. Then she looked at her hands, red, raw from the hot water, the skin around her cuticles split and stinging from the lemon soap. Slowly, without a sound, she closed the laptop. The radiator in Eleni's bedroom began its morning sequence at 6 a.m. It started with 3 sharp metallic raps, like a small hammer striking a pipe deep behind the drywall, followed by a long, wet hiss that smelled faintly of rusty steam and old dust. Eleni lay motionless beneath her thin cotton quilt, Her eyes had opened 5 minutes before the alarm. She didn't move her legs immediately. She knew the stiffness in her lower back would require a slow, deliberate roll to the side of the mattress. Her bedroom was the smallest in the house, a converted sewing room directly above the garage. In the winter, it was a freezer. In the spring, it trapped the dampness of the morning fog. She sat up, her feet finding the cold, bare floorboards. In the kitchen downstairs, the kettle was already whistling. It wasn't the clean, electric chime of a modern appliance, but the thin, reedy shriek of her mother's copper kettle. Eleni dressed in her uniform, dark scrub pants and a pale blue polo shirt with Northside Physical Therapy embroidered over the left breast. She pulled her hair back into a tight, low ponytail, securing it with a plain black band. In the mirror, the skin under her eyes looked thin, almost gray, like wet parchment. When she entered the kitchen, the scent of burnt toast hung heavy in the air. Spiros sat at the small formica-top table in the corner. He was 62, but his shoulders had the permanent rounded slope of a man who had spent 40 years lifting heavy wool coats and steam-pressing trousers. His thick, yellowed thumbnails were stained with the dark dye of the garments he handled at the shop. He didn't look up when Eleni entered. He was staring at a blue slip of paper, a past-due notice from the municipal water district for the dry cleaning shop. "They're going to shut off the meter on the 20th, Spiros said, his voice gravelly from his first cigarette of the morning. He didn't ask Eleni how she slept. He didn't ask if she wanted coffee. "The dry cleaner needs water, Eleni. We can't run the boiler without it." Eleni stood by the counter. She reached for the generic coffee tin, only to find it light. Inside, there were only 3 tablespoons of stale grounds left. "I know," Eleni said quietly. "I thought you took care of it last week," Spiros said. He tapped the blue paper with his thick finger. "The notice says the payment was due on the 1st. Today is the 10th. Eleni poured the last of the coffee grounds into the filter. She calculated the balance of her father's business account in her head. After paying the lease on the presser and the monthly chemical delivery, the shop's account had $92 left. She had intended to transfer $900 from her own savings last Friday to cover the water bill and the payroll tax, but that was the same day Maria had insisted on the deposit for the custom gold foil wedding invitations. "I'll look at the ledger tonight, Papa," Eleni said. "Don't just look at it," Spiros grunted, his tone dry, defensive. "Pay it. If the shop closes for even 1 day, we lose the hotel contract. If we lose the hotel, how do we pay for Sophia's dinner? The Vardis family is inviting their cousins from Boston. We cannot look like beggars." He folded the blue notice, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and stood up. His knees made a wet, cracking sound as he straightened. He walked past her, his flannel shirt smelling of cold tobacco and dry cleaning solvent, and let himself out through the back door. A moment later, his old delivery van rumbled to life in the driveway, its exhaust coughing twice before settling into a rattling idle. Eleni watched the steam rise from her coffee cup. She reached into the refrigerator for the milk. The carton was light. Sophia had used the last of the organic whole milk for her iced matcha latte the afternoon before. Normally, Eleni would stop at the corner bodega on her way home from work to buy more, making sure it was the exact brand Sophia preferred. Today, Eleni set the empty carton back on the shelf. She drank her coffee black. It was bitter, lukewarm, and tasted of the copper kettle. At 6:45 a.m., the ceiling fan in the hallway upstairs stopped spinning, and the sound of light, hurried footsteps began. Sophia came down the stairs, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf, her face covered in a layer of glistening overnight cream. She was holding a large rectangular cardboard box with the logo of a high-end bridal boutique printed in silver. "Eleni," Sophia said, her voice high and breathless with a manufactured urgency. She set the box directly on the wet kitchen counter, right next to the greasy stoneware plates Eleni had left in the sink. "The heel on the left shoe is loose, just a little bit. I think the glue dried out in the box." Eleni didn't look at the box. She took a slow sip of her black coffee. "Take it back to the boutique, Sophia." "I don't have time," Sophia said, her lower lip turning down in a practiced pout. She picked up her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. "I have the tasting with the cake decorator at 11, and then I have to meet Dimitri's aunt to look at the table linens. You pass the cobbler on your way to the clinic anyway. It will take you 5 minutes." Eleni looked at the box. The boutique was 3 miles in the opposite direction of her commute. The cobbler didn't open until 9 a.m. Her shift started at 8 a.m. To make the trip, she would have to leave work during her 30-minute lunch break, skip eating, and drive through the midday delivery traffic. "The left shoe," Sophia repeated, not waiting for an answer. She reached into the pantry, searching the shelves. "Eleni, where is the almond milk? I told you I need the unsweetened one. My skin is breaking out from the regular dairy, and the photographer said the high-definition cameras catch every single bump." "There isn't any," Eleni said. Sophia stopped searching. She turned around, her eyes wide, with a mixture of disbelief and annoyance. "What do you mean there isn't any? I put it on the list on Sunday." "I didn't go to the store," Eleni said. "But I have my bridal portrait session on Thursday." Sophia's voice rose, a sharp, whiny edge cutting through the quiet kitchen. "How am I supposed to do the green smoothie without the milk? You know I can't have solid food 3 days before the shoot. My stomach bloats." She waited, her hands on her hips, her gaze fixed on Eleni. For years, this look had been enough to make Eleni apologize, to make her grab her car keys and run to the 24-hour supermarket before her shift even started. Eleni looked at the small kitchen window. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the gray smog of the city, casting a pale yellow stripe across the linoleum. "There is tap water," Eleni said. Sophia blinked, her mouth opened slightly, as if she were trying to determine if Eleni was joking. But Eleni's face remained perfectly still, her eyes empty of any emotion. "You're being really weird lately," Sophia muttered, her tone turning cold. She snatched her phone off the counter. "Fine, I'll ask Ma to get it, but you need to fix the shoe. Dimitri's mother is going to be at the linen selection, and she wants to see the shoes with the fabric." Sophia turned and walked back up the stairs, the silk ties of her robe trailing behind her like water. Eleni stood in the kitchen for another minute. She picked up her black vinyl purse and her car keys from the hook by the door. She looked at the silver-branded shoebox sitting on the wet laminate counter. A small puddle of dirty dishwater from last night's plates had begun to soak into the bottom corner of the cardboard, leaving a dark, gray stain that slowly crept upward toward the silver logo. Eleni didn't touch it. She walked out, leaving the box where it lay. Outside, the air was cold and damp. She climbed into her Honda Civic and turned the key. The engine cranked twice, a slow, heavy groan, before finally catching. On the dashboard, the orange low-fuel light glowed steadily, a quiet, persistent eye in the dim cabin. She put the car in reverse. As she backed down the driveway, the front brakes let out a long, high-pitched shriek that echoed off the brick walls of the neighbors' houses. The Northside Physical Therapy Clinic smelled permanently of mint-flavored analgesic cream and hot laundry detergent from the industrial dryer in the back. By 10:15 a.m., the reception desk was cluttered with half-filled intake forms, laminated insurance cheat sheets, and 3 separate plastic clipboards with broken pens dangling from dirty blue strings. Eleni sat behind the acrylic sneeze guard, her fingers moving across the numeric keypad of her desktop computer with a dull, rhythmic speed. Tab. Enter. 90210. Tab. Enter. In the treatment bay behind her, the low, wet thumping of a patient walking on a treadmill provided a steady baseline, accompanied by the occasional sharp beep of an ultrasound machine. A heavy silence lingered in the air between the patient arrivals. Dr. Kenneth, a semi-retired physical therapist whose knuckles were swollen with the very arthritis he treated, stood by the water cooler, slowly peeling the skin off a bruised clementine. "Eleni," he said, his voice dry and papery, "did the authorization for the Miller boy come through yet? His mother is calling every 20 minutes. "Not yet, doctor," Eleni said, without looking up from her screen. "Blue Cross is requesting the clinical notes from January. I faxed them over twice yesterday. I'll call them again during my lunch." "Good girl," he mumbled, popping a pale orange wedge into his mouth. "You're a lifesaver." He walked back into his private office, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the gap, Eleni could hear the soft, tinny sound of a horse race playing on his tablet. He had been retiring for 5 years, slowly shifting the administrative weight of the clinic onto Eleni's shoulders, until she was not only the receptionist, but the billing specialist, the office manager, and the person who scrubbed the toilets when the cleaning service missed a Tuesday. Her personal phone, resting face down on a stack of unpaid electric bills for her father's dry cleaning shop, began to vibrate. The vibration made a dry, buzzing sound against the wood of the desk. She didn't pick it up. She knew the rhythm of the ring. 2 short buzzes, a pause, then 3 long ones. Sophia. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a continuous, frantic vibration. Her mother. Eleni finished entering a claim for a torn rotator cuff, verified the diagnostic code, and clicked Submit. Only then did she reach for the phone. She slid her thumb across the screen and held the receiver to her ear, her shoulder pinning it to her shoulder blade as she continued to type with her right hand. "Eleni?" Maria's voice was thin, sharp with an undercurrent of panic that always sounded like a physical blow. "Where are you? Why aren't you answering?" "I'm at work, Ma," Eleni said. Her voice was level, almost mechanical. "Sophia is beside herself," Maria whispered, her voice dropping into the theatrical tone she used when she wanted to convey a family tragedy. "She went downstairs to get her tea, and she found her shoes. The beautiful box from the boutique. It was sitting in a puddle of water on the counter. The bottom of the box is completely mush, Eleni, and the heel of the left shoe. She says it smells like old fish from the plates." Eleni's hand paused over the keyboard. She looked at her thumb, where a small yellow stain from the kitchen grease had settled into the crease of her knuckle. "The box was on the counter when I left." "But why didn't you take them to the cobbler?" Maria's voice rose, the whisper dissolving into high-pitched indignation. "Sophia said she asked you specifically. She said you promised." "I didn't promise," Eleni said. "I said I'd look at them." "Eleni, please," Maria sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 30 years of domestic martyrdom. "Don't do this. Not now. Sophia has her fitting on Friday. If the shoes are ruined, we have to order another pair from New York, and the shipping alone will be $80. You know how stressed she is. She hasn't slept in 3 days. Her skin—" "I have a patient at the window, Ma," Eleni lied. Her gaze was actually fixed on the small glass window of the reception area, which was completely empty. Through the glass, she could see her own car parked under the rusted fire escape of the building across the street. The Honda looked small, dusty, and slightly tilted to the left because the driver's side strut was failing. "You'll go after work?" Maria pressed, ignoring Eleni's excuse. "The cobbler stays open until 7 on Wednesdays. Just go, apologize to the man, and tell him it's for the Varda's wedding. He knows Spiros. He'll do it fast." Eleni didn't answer. She let the silence stretch between them, a long, hollow space filled only by the distant thump, thump of the treadmill in the next room. "Eleni?" "I have to go, Ma," Eleni said, and hung up before her mother could respond. She set the phone down. It did not ring again immediately, but a text message notification chimed a minute later. It was a photo from Sophia, a close-up of the damp, gray cardboard box, followed by 3 exclamation points and a single text. "You did this on purpose." At 1 p.m., Eleni took her lunch break. She didn't go to the staff room, which smelled of Dr. Kennett's microwaved fish. Instead, she took her brown paper bag, walked out of the clinic, and climbed into the front seat of her car. The interior of the Honda was cold, retaining the damp chill of the morning. She sat in the quiet cabin, her hands resting on the steering wheel. The steering wheel cover was cracked, showing the black foam beneath. She opened her paper bag. Inside was a single piece of dry rye bread and a small block of yellow cheddar cheese she had sliced the night before. She didn't eat it. She simply stared at it. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her personal banking application. She went to the Scheduled Transfers tab. There, waiting in the queue for Friday morning, was the transfer of $4,200 to Evergreen Floral Designs. Below it, she looked at her remaining balances. If she let that transfer go through on Friday, her checking account would have exactly $12.15 left. Her own health insurance premium, the one she paid out of pocket because the clinic didn't offer benefits, was due on the 15th. It was $380. If she paid the florist, her insurance would lapse. She tapped the transfer details. Her finger hovered over the red button that said, "Cancel transfer." Her heart didn't beat faster. Her breath didn't catch. She felt only a strange, cold clarity, like the air in her bedroom at 6 a.m. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The eldest sister. The one who didn't need new clothes because she didn't go anywhere anyway. The one who didn't need a vacation because she loved her work. The one who had spent her entire 20s standing between her family's pride and the red ink of the bankruptcy court. She didn't cancel the transfer, not yet. Instead, she tapped the transfer date and changed it from Friday to Monday. A 3-day delay. Just enough to let her paycheck clear, but also just enough to ensure the florist's automatic payment system would flag the transaction as pending over the weekend. The very weekend Sophia was scheduled to have her final bridal showcase with the Varda's family. She locked her phone and set it on the passenger seat. She took a bite of the dry cheese. It was hard, salty, and cold against her tongue. She chewed slowly, her eyes fixed on the rusted fire escape across the street, while her phone began to vibrate again in the dark. The self-service pump at the Shell station on the corner of 8th and Elm had a cracked glass display that had turned yellow under years of harsh winter sun. Eleni stood in the wind, her fingers curled tightly around the cold, greasy handle of the nozzle. The air smelled of unleaded gasoline, damp asphalt, and the sweet, synthetic scent of pine-scented car fresheners from the convenience store door that opened and closed with a tinny double chime. She watched the mechanical numbers on the pump dial roll upward, 1250, 1300, $13.50. At exactly $15, she released the lever. The nozzle clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that signaled the end of the flow. $15 bought less than 4 gallons, just enough to keep the orange low fuel light from glowing on her dashboard for the next 3 days of commuting. She didn't want to use her debit card. She wanted to keep her checking account balance exactly where it was, untouched, until her Friday paycheck was deposited. She reached into her vinyl purse, pulled out 3 $5 bills, old, soft, and smelling of lint, and walked toward the glass booth to pay the attendant. When she finally pulled into the narrow driveway of her family's house at 6:30 p.m., the streetlights were already flickering on, casting long, pale shadows across the cracked concrete. The front brakes of her Honda let out a long, dying screech as she stopped the car behind her father's delivery van. Inside, the house was warm, but it was a heavy, suffocating warmth. The radiator in the hallway was clanking again, and the scent of fried onions and lamb fat clung to the floral wallpaper in the vestibule. Maria was standing at the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand, her face flushed from the heat of the gas burners. On the dining room table, Sophia sat surrounded by white lace samples, 3 different catalogs of wedding favors, and the damp, water-stained shoebox from the boutique. "You're late," Maria said, without turning around from the stove. She dropped a handful of chopped parsley into a simmering pot of tomato sauce. "Your father is still at the shop. He called twice. The steam press is leaking from the main valve again, and he says he can't find the receipt from the repairman who came last month. He wants you to look in the blue drawer." Eleni hung her black coat on the brass peg behind the door. The peg was loose. It wiggled slightly under the weight of her coat, a small repair she had meaning to do for 6 months. "I'll look later," Eleni said. Sophia looked up from her lace samples. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her mouth was pulled into a tight, thin line. "The cobbler closed 30 minutes ago, Eleni. I called them. They said nobody brought in a pair of white satin heels today." Eleni walked to the sink, turned on the cold water faucet, and washed her hands. The soap was a cheap, generic bar that left a dry, chalky film on her skin. "I told you I didn't have time on my lunch, Sophia." "You didn't have 5 minutes?" Sophia's voice rose, reaching that high, fragile pitch she used when she wanted to summon their mother's intervention. "My fitting is on Friday morning. The seamstress needs the exact height of the heel to hem the satin. If the heel is loose, the dress will drag on the church carpet. It's a $4,000 gown, Eleni. Do you want me to trip on the altar?" "Sophia, please," Maria said, turning around with the wooden spoon held like a scepter. She looked at Eleni with a deep, weary frown. "Your sister is right. It's one thing to be busy, Eleni, but this is her wedding. You have only one sister. If you can't help her now, when can you help her?" Eleni dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She looked at the two of them, her mother, whose entire social life consisted of telling the ladies at the parish about her younger daughter's brilliant match to the Vardas family, and Sophia, who had never paid a single utility bill in her life. She made her calculation. The emotional energy required to explain that she had spent her lunch hour calling Blue Cross to authorize a child's physical therapy, that her own car's brakes were down to the metal, and that she was currently carrying $28,000 of the wedding's debt on her own credit cards. She chose silence. "The shoes are in the living room," Eleni said, her voice perfectly level. "If you take them tomorrow morning at 8, the cobbler can have them done by noon. He charges an extra $15 for express service." "$15?" Sophia scoffed, throwing her hands up. "Why should I have to pay $15 because you couldn't be bothered to do what you said you'd do?" "I didn't say I'd do it," Eleni said. "You left them on the counter," Sophia cried. "You saw them there." "I saw them," Eleni agreed. She didn't offer to pay the $15. She didn't offer to drive them tomorrow. She simply walked past the dining table, her eyes scanning the white lace samples and the gold foil invitations without a single flicker of interest. "Eleni," Maria called out, her voice sharp with rising annoyance. "Where are you going? The table isn't set. Your father will be home in 10 minutes, and the salad needs to be tossed." Normally, this was Eleni's routine. She would set the table, toss the salad, pour her father's glass of red wine, serve the plates, and then wash the dishes while the others sat in the living room drinking coffee and watching television. "I'm not hungry, Ma," Eleni said. "I'm going to my room." "What do you mean you're not hungry?" Maria's voice followed her as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "We have the lemon chicken. I made it because you said last week we didn't have enough vegetables." "Eleni!" Eleni didn't stop. She climbed the stairs, her feet finding the creaky spots in the wood with practiced ease, avoiding the loudest boards. Her room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside her window, which cast the skeletal shadow of the old maple tree across her ceiling. She closed her door and locked it. It was a simple brass latch she had installed herself 3 years ago, despite her father's complaints that there are no secrets in this family. She sat on her bed. In the quiet, she could hear the muffled sound of her mother and sister talking downstairs. Their voices were low, a steady, rhythmic murmur of irritation. They were annoyed. They thought she was being difficult. They thought she was jealous. Eleni reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and opened her calendar. Thursday, clinic 8 to 6. Friday, clinic 8 to 5. Saturday, Sophia's linen showcase at the Varda's estate, 1 p.m. She looked at Saturday. The linen showcase was the first official gathering where the two families would sit down together to approve the final design of the reception. The florist had to bring the sample centerpieces, the white hydrangeas. Eleni clicked on the Monday date on her calendar, where she had rescheduled the $4,200 transfer. She tapped the screen, deleting the reminder she had set for herself to check the transaction. She didn't need a reminder. She knew exactly what would happen on Saturday when the florist realized the deposit had not cleared. She lay back on her pillow, her eyes tracking the slow, rhythmic sweep of the maple tree's shadow across her wall. The air inside Spiros Quality Cleaners was a thick, humid fog that smelled of hot wool, burnt sizing, and the sharp, metallic sting of perchloroethylene. It was 7:20 a.m. on Thursday. The shop's yellowed fluorescent tubes flickered twice before humming to life, casting a cold green glow over the long racks of plastic-draped garments that hung from the ceiling like a forest of transparent cocoons. Spiros was already at the utility press, his heavy foot clamping the metal pedal down with a dull thunk, followed by a loud white hiss of steam that billowed up around his face. His forehead was slick with sweat, his gray hair clinging to his temples in damp spikes. Eleni stood by the wooden counter near the register. She set down a worn, blue, expanding file folder containing the sorted tax receipts from the previous year. "Here are the files for the accountant, Papa," Eleni said, her voice barely carrying over the steady, mechanical rumble of the boiler in the basement. "The deductions are categorized by month. The payroll slips are in the back." Spiros didn't look up from the trouser leg he was aligning on the padded press. He brought the heavy iron plate down with a loud groan of the springs. "Did you call the water district?" "No," Eleni said. Spiros paused. He kept his hand on the lever of the press, his eyes remaining fixed on the crease of the fabric. "What do you mean, no? I told you yesterday. The notice said the 20th. That's next week." "The water district requires a certified check or an electronic transfer from the business checking account," Eleni said, her voice remaining flat, empty of any defensive strain. "The business account has $92 in it." "So transfer it," Spiros grunted, finally lifting the press. A fresh cloud of steam rose, smelling of damp cotton and scorched metal. "Transfer it from your account like you always do. I'll give it back to you next month when the hotel pays their invoice." This was the cycle. For 4 years, since Spiros's credit rating had collapsed during the tax audit, Eleni had been the quiet buffer. The hotel invoice was always late, the chemical bills were always urgent, and Eleni's personal savings account was the silent reservoir that filled the gaps. The next month Spiros spoke of never arrived. The money simply dissolved into the daily friction of keeping the old, inefficient shop alive. Before Eleni could answer, a heavy, double blast of a horn sounded from the narrow alleyway behind the shop. Spiros wiped his brow with the sleeve of his flannel shirt. "That's Apex. They're early." Through the frosted glass of the back door, the silhouette of a large delivery truck was visible, its diesel engine idling with a deep, rattling vibration that shook the wire hangers on the racks. Spiros walked to the back door and unlocked it, letting in a draft of cold morning air that cut through the humid heat of the shop. A stocky driver in a grease-stained uniform stood on the concrete step, holding a clipboard and a yellow delivery ticket. "2 drums of solvent, Spiros," the driver said, his voice loud and impatient. "But the boss says no drop-off without payment today. Your account has been on stop since Tuesday." Spiros's face darkened, a deep red flush rising from his collar. He looked at the driver, then turned his head slowly to look at Eleni, who was still standing by the front register. His chest swelled, his traditional pride instantly bruised by the presence of a witness to his financial embarrassment. "There is a mistake," Spiros told the driver, his voice tightening. "My daughter manages the books. She is the manager. Eleni, give him the check." The driver looked past Spiros to Eleni. He tapped his ballpoint pen against the metal clipboard. $1,150, plus the drum deposit. Cash, certified check, or credit card. "No personal checks from the business anymore," the boss said. Eleni didn't move toward the register. She didn't open her purse. She stood with her hands folded over the strap of her vinyl bag, her posture perfectly still. "We don't have the certified check today," Eleni said to the driver. Spiros took 2 steps toward her, his heavy leather work boots squeaking on the linoleum. "Eleni," he hissed, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register, though he kept his eyes darting toward the driver. "What are you saying? Use your card, the one you used for the press parts last winter. Pay him so he can unload." "The card is at its limit, Papa," Eleni said. It was a lie, but only a partial one. Her personal credit card had $2,400 of remaining limit, exactly the amount she needed to keep open in case her car's failing front axle collapsed completely on the highway, or if she had to pay her own medical deductible next month. "Limit?" Spiros whispered, his eyes narrowing into 2 dark, furious slits. "How can it be at the limit? You make good money at the clinic. You have no mortgage, no husband, no children. What are you spending your money on?" The question hung in the humid air of the shop, heavy and suffocating. Eleni looked at her father. She looked at the deep lines around his mouth, the stains on his apron, the swollen knuckles of his hands. She calculated the energy it would take to list the expenses of the last 6 months. The $4,000 deposit on Sophia's gown, the $3,000 venue holding fee, the $1,600 invitation printer, the $500 bridal hair trial. All paid from her personal card because Sophia had cried that the Vardas family cannot know we have to budget. She chose the silence. She let his question hang there, unanswered, like a physical weight between them. "I have to go to work, Papa," she said quietly. My shift starts in 20 minutes. Eleni. Spiro stepped closer, his voice rising, forgetting the driver who was still watching from the doorway. You leave me here like this? With no solvent? How am I supposed to run the machine tomorrow? I have 80 wool coats from the St. Demetrios dance committee coming in tonight. I don't have the $1,100, Papa, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a bank teller explaining a policy to a customer who had insufficient funds. The money is gone. She picked up her purse, walked around the side of the wooden counter, and headed toward the front door. Spiros didn't follow her, but she could hear his heavy, ragged breathing behind her. You are selfish, he spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and genuine, bewildered panic. Your sister is getting married next week. The whole community is watching us, and you want to ruin this family over a chemical bill? You have no respect. No respect for your father. Eleni pushed open the front glass door. The brass bell above it chimed, a light, cheerful sound that cut through the heavy atmosphere of the shop. As she walked out onto the cold, damp sidewalk, she heard the heavy steel door of the delivery truck slam shut in the alley, followed by the deep, grinding gear change of the diesel engine as the driver pulled away without unloading the drums. She climbed into her Honda. Her hands were cold as she gripped the steering wheel. She turned the key, and the engine groaned, catching on the third crank. She looked at her dashboard. The orange low fuel light was still glowing, a tiny, steady beacon in the early morning gray. She put the car in gear, her front brakes letting out that familiar, high-pitched shriek as she pulled into the morning traffic. The basement laundry room was cold, illuminated by a single, bare 60-watt bulb that hung from a frayed black cord. It smelled of damp concrete, old lint, and the faint, sour odor of standing water in the washing machine's drain hose. It was 9:45 p.m. on Thursday. Eleni stood before the dryer, her hands moving with a quiet, efficient rhythm. She pulled out her 5 pairs of dark blue scrubs, shaking each one out with a sharp snap before folding them into neat, square piles on top of the rusted metal casing of the machine. These were her clothes. They were cheap, polyester blend fabrics that dried quickly and didn't require ironing. Beside the dryer sat the heavy, double-sized wicker hamper. It was overflowing with Sophia's linen trousers, her lace-trimmed camisoles, her satin pajamas, and Spiros's heavy cotton work socks. Usually, on Thursday nights, Eleni spent 3 hours sorting these clothes, treating the stains with a small horsehair brush and specialized solvent she brought home from the dry cleaner, and hanging the delicate silks on plastic hangers to air dry over the laundry tub. Tonight, the wicker hamper remained untouched. The damp, sour scent of Sophia's discarded gym clothes rose from the bottom of the basket, but Eleni did not reach for them. She picked up her small pile of folded scrubs, cradled them in her left arm, and turned off the basement light. As she climbed the wooden stairs, the kitchen above was silent. The dinner plates from tonight's meal, the lemon chicken her mother had made, sat on the dining table, the greasy residue of the sauce hardening into a pale yellow crust around the edges of the stoneware. Nobody had cleared the table. Nobody had wiped the counter. Without Eleni there to perform the transition from dinner to clean kitchen, the room had simply stalled, frozen in a state of post-meal decay. She was halfway up the stairs to her bedroom when her mother's door opened. Maria stepped out into the hallway, her face pale, her hair tied back in a loose, messy bun. She was holding a cream-colored silk dress, the one Sophia was supposed to wear to the rehearsal dinner next week. "Eleni," Maria said, her voice carrying a sharp, thin edge of confusion. "Did you look in the laundry basket? Sophia's rehearsal dress is still at the bottom. It has a small coffee mark on the lapel from Tuesday. If it doesn't get washed tonight, The stain will set into the silk." Eleni paused on the step. The wood beneath her left foot creaked softly under her weight. "I saw it, Ma." "Then why didn't you put it in?" Maria stepped closer to the banister, holding the dress out as if Eleni's eyes alone could clean the fabric. "You know Sophia can't wear a stained dress to the Varda's house. Dimitri's mother is very particular about these things. She'll notice. She notices everything." "I only did a load for my scrubs," Eleni said. Her voice was quiet, lacking any defensive heat. "But the machine was already running," Maria said, her brow furrowing in genuine bewilderment. "You were already down there. It takes 2 minutes to throw the silk in on the delicate cycle. Why would you leave it?" This was the core of their world, the absolute conviction that Eleni's time and effort were free, liquid resources that required no investment and no consideration. To Maria, leaving the dress in the hamper wasn't a choice based on fatigue or boundary. It was an act of deliberate, inexplicable omission. "I didn't have the delicate detergent," Eleni said. "We're out." "Then you should have bought some." Sophia's voice cut in from her bedroom doorway. She stood there in her silk robe, her phone held in her hand, her face dark with irritation. "I told you last week that the lavender wool wash was almost empty. You know I can't use the regular detergent on my silks. It ruins the sheen." Eleni looked at her sister. Sophia's face was smooth, free of the lines of exhaustion that carved deep hollows under Eleni's own eyes. "The wool wash is $6, Sophia," Eleni said. "The grocery store is 3 blocks away." Sophia let out a short, incredulous laugh. She looked at Maria as if appealing to a referee. "Ma, do you hear her? She's telling me to go to the grocery store. I have my final hair trial tomorrow at 9, then the florist at noon, and then I have to go to the venue to approve the seating charts. When am I supposed to go to the store to buy soap?" "Eleni, please," Maria sighed, her voice adopting that familiar, heavy tone of maternal suffering. "Don't start an argument now. Your father came home so stressed tonight. He's in the garage trying to fix the valve on the press himself because the service company wouldn't come out without a deposit. His hands are black with grease. We don't need this drama over a bottle of soap." Eleni stood on the stair. She calculated the energy of the room. She could feel the familiar pull, the urge to explain, to apologize, to offer to run to the 24-hour drugstore right now just to stop the rising tide of their irritation. She looked down at her folded scrubs. They were warm from the dryer, the only warm thing in the cold house. "The dress is silk," Eleni said, her voice dropping into a flat, steady drone. "If you put it in a basin with lukewarm water and a drop of dish soap, the stain will come out. Don't rub the fabric, just squeeze it." Sophia stared at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disgust. "You want me to wash it in the sink? With dish soap? Are you crazy? It's a designer dress, Eleni. If I ruin it, it's gone." "Then don't ruin it," Eleni said. She turned and continued up the stairs. "Eleni!" Maria called after her, her voice rising in pitch, no longer trying to hide her anger. "What is wrong with you lately? You are being so cold. Your sister is getting married. This is the happiest time of her life, and you are acting like a stranger in this house." Eleni didn't look back. She reached her door, stepped inside, and closed it. She didn't slide the brass latch immediately. She stood in the dark room, listening. Downstairs, her mother's footsteps hurried down the hall toward the kitchen, followed by the sharp, angry clatter of the dirty dinner plates being stacked in the sink. Sophia's door slammed shut with a heavy bang that vibrated through the floorboards of Eleni's room. Eleni walked to her bed and set her folded scrubs on the quilt. She did not turn on the light. She walked to the window and looked out into the dark driveway, Her father's delivery van was parked there, its rusted rear bumper catching the pale glare of the street lamp. From the garage at the end of the driveway, a thin slice of yellow light spilled out onto the gravel, accompanied by the occasional dull clang of a wrench hitting metal. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and opened her personal email. There was a new message from Evergreen Floral Designs, sent at 8:12 p.m. Dear Eleni, we are writing to confirm that your pending transfer for the weekend showcase centerpieces, $4,200, has been rescheduled to Monday, June 15th. Please note that our policy requires cleared funds 48 hours prior to delivery. Because the transfer will not clear before the Saturday afternoon showcase at the Vardis estate, we will only be able to provide the basic green foliage mock-ups rather than the custom white hydrangeas. If you wish to expedite this, please contact our billing office immediately. Eleni stared at the screen. The white light of the phone illuminated the sharp, tight lines of her face. She didn't call the billing office. She didn't reply to the email. She deleted the notification, locked her phone, and slipped it under her pillow. A thick, low-lying mist had rolled in from the bay overnight, wrapping the neighborhood in a damp, gray shroud that smelled of salt water and rotting river reeds. It was Friday, 7:05 a.m. Eleni sat in the driver's seat of her Honda Civic, waiting for the engine to warm up. The car's idle was rough, a rhythmic metal-on-metal shudder that vibrated through the worn foam of the steering wheel and into the soles of her feet. On the passenger seat lay her lunch bag, a single hard-boiled egg and a small container of plain yogurt, and her work clipboard. She pressed her thumb against the defroster button on the dashboard. The fan kicked on with a dry, dusty rattle, blowing a weak stream of lukewarm air against the cold windshield, slowly melting the heavy condensation into long, sluggish tears of water that slid down the glass. Through the clear triangle of her windshield, she saw the kitchen window of the house. The light inside was a warm, buttery yellow, contrasting sharply with the cold gray of the morning. The front door of the house flew open. Sophia hurried down the concrete steps. She was wearing her pink plush bridal robe over her flannel pajamas, and her hair was pinned up in a dozen metal clips that caught the dull morning light like tiny staples. Her feet were shoved into flat, fluffy slippers that were instantly soaked by the heavy dew on the lawn as she cut across the grass toward Eleni's car. Eleni didn't put the car in reverse. She simply watched her sister approach, her hand resting lightly on the cold plastic gearshift. Sophia reached the driver's side door and tapped sharply on the glass with her acrylic nail. A high, irritating click, click, click. Eleni rolled the window down halfway. A draft of damp, cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying the heavy scent of Sophia's expensive coconut hair oil. "Eleni, I need your visa," Sophia said, her voice high and hurried, her breath puffing into small white clouds in the cold air. She was shivering, her shoulders hunched. The salon called. The stylist for the trial needs the $300 deposit cleared before she opens the chair at 9. And she said she needs the final bridesmaid headcount deposit too. It's $450 total. "No," Eleni said. Sophia blinked. She wiped a stray drop of condensation from her cheek, her forehead twisting in confusion. "What do you mean, no? I told you on Tuesday this was due today. Ma said you were covering the beauty package as part of your wedding gift." "I'm not covering it," Eleni said. Her voice was flat, level, and entirely devoid of anger. It had the same neutral quality she used when telling clinic patients that their insurance had denied a claim. "Eleni, this isn't funny. Sophia's voice took on a sharp, whiny edge. She gripped the top of the car window, her knuckles turning white. "The trial is at 9. If I don't pay the deposit now, she'll cancel the appointment and give the slot to another bride. You know how hard it is to get a Friday slot with her. Dimitri's mother is meeting us there at 10 to see the veil placement." "I don't have the 450, Sophia," Eleni said. "Just put it on the card." Sophia stamped her slipper-clad foot on the wet gravel of the driveway, splashing a small pool of muddy water onto her white robe. "You always have room on the card. Just call them and ask for a temporary limit increase. You did that for Papa's press parts last winter. Why can't you do it for me?" "The card is locked," Eleni said. "Then unlock it!" Sophia cried, her face flushing a deep, angry pink beneath her cream. "You're doing this on purpose. You're trying to ruin my day. You're jealous because Dimitri is taking me to the Bahamas for our honeymoon, and you're still sitting in this stupid driveway in this stupid car." Eleni looked at Sophia's fingers gripping the glass of the window. She noticed a small smudge of gray grease on the cuff of Sophia's white robe, likely from the wet shoebox she had dragged off the kitchen counter yesterday. She made her calculation. The energy required to explain that she had no intention of calling the credit card company, that she had spent her evening locking her accounts to prevent automatic overdrafts, and that she felt absolutely nothing when Sophia spoke of the Bahamas. "I'm going to be late for work," Eleni said. She rolled the window back up. Sophia's fingers slipped off the glass as it rose. She stood in the wet gravel, her mouth open in a look of pure, unadulterated shock. She began to hit the glass with the palm of her hand, her voice muffled through the double-pane window, but Eleni didn't look at her again. Eleni shifted the gear into reverse. She let her foot off the clutch. The Honda moved backwards slowly, its front brakes letting out a piercing metallic shriek that echoed off the damp brick of the garage. Sophia had to take 3 hurried, clumsy steps backward into the wet grass to avoid the front bumper, her fluffy slippers sinking deep into the mud. Through the rearview mirror, Eleni saw the front door of the house open again. Maria stood on the porch, holding a steaming mug of coffee, her face twisted in a look of sharp disapproval as she watched the car back out into the street. Eleni didn't stop. She cleared the driveway, shifted into first gear, and drove away. The drive to the clinic was unusually quiet. The fog was thick along the boulevard, swallowing the headlights of the oncoming cars and turning the neon signs of the local diners into soft, blurry smears of red and blue. At 7:30 a.m., she pulled into the small gravel lot of a corner bakery 3 miles from her house. It wasn't the artisanal pastry shop Sophia insisted on for her morning lattes. It was a plain, run-down bakery owned by an elderly Portuguese couple who still used a paper cash register. Eleni walked inside. The air was warm, smelling of fresh yeast, cinnamon, and cheap, strong chicory coffee. "The usual, Eleni?" the woman behind the counter asked, offering a small, tired smile. "Just a black coffee, Clara," Eleni said. "And a plain roll, no butter." $2.50, Clara said. Eleni reached into her purse. She didn't pull out her credit card. She reached into the small coin pocket and pulled out exactly $2 bills and 2 quarters, coins she had cleared from her car's cup holder the night before. She handed the physical money over. She sat at a small, wobbly metal table by the window, watching the fog swirl around the street lamps outside. She dipped the dry roll into her hot, black coffee, watching the dark liquid slowly soak into the pale dough. For the first time in 6 months, her phone did not vibrate. She had placed it on Do Not Disturb before leaving the driveway, restricting all calls except those from the physical therapy clinic. The quiet was immense. It felt heavy, solid, and completely hers. The blue light of the clinic's computer screen cast a pale, cold glow over Eleni's face as she processed the final transaction of the week. It was 5:15 p.m. on Friday. The clinic was entirely quiet now, save for the hum of the small bar fridge in the staff break room and the occasional distant sigh of the building's old ventilation system. Dr. Kenneth had left at 4, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor before the glass front doors clicked shut. Eleni took a blue canister of antiseptic wipes from the shelf. She walked through the empty treatment bays, wiping down the vinyl-covered bolster pillows and the chrome adjustment bars of the physical therapy tables. She worked slowly, with a steady, mechanical precision. She liked the routine of closing. It was predictable. If you wiped a surface, it became clean. If you locked a cabinet, it stayed locked. Once the tables were sanitized, she returned to the reception desk. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and turned off the "Do Not Disturb" mode. The screen instantly came to life. 14 missed calls, 11 text messages, 3 from her father, 4 from her mother, 7 from Sophia. She didn't open the text messages. She didn't listen to the voicemails. She simply looked at the digital notifications, her face expressionless, before sliding the phone back into the dark recess of her purse. When she arrived home at 6 p.m., the street was quiet. The fog had lifted, replaced by a sharp, biting wind that rattled the dry branches of the maple tree against the telephone wires. She parked her Honda behind her father's delivery van. The squeal of her front brakes seemed louder in the cold evening air, a dry, metallic screech that brought a neighbor's curtain fluttering open across the street. She walked up the concrete steps and pushed open the heavy front door. The interior of the house was cold. The radiators were silent, and there was no smell of dinner, no garlic, no roasted potatoes, no simmering sauce. The house smelled only of damp wool and stale coffee. In the kitchen, the overhead light was turned off. Only the small yellow bulb above the stove was lit, casting a dim, greasy glow over the room. Maria sat at the laminate table. Next to her was Sophia. Sophia's hair was a disaster. Half of it was pinned up in a complex, nested bun of curls, but the other half hung limp and straight down her shoulder, the metal clips sticking out of her scalp like rusted nails. It looked like an unfinished project, a monument to a sudden, violent interruption. On the center of the table lay a small white paper envelope. It was empty, its flap torn open roughly. Neither of them spoke when Eleni walked in. Eleni took off her black coat and hung it on the loose brass peg. The peg groaned slightly, but held. She walked to the sink, took a clean glass from the drying rack, and filled it with tap water. The water was cold, clouding the glass with tiny, swirling air bubbles. "Your father had to give them the cash," Maria said. Her voice was very quiet, hollowed out by a deep, defensive fatigue. Eleni took a slow sip of her water. She didn't turn around. She watched the dark reflection of her mother and sister in the glass of the kitchen window. "The salon," Maria continued, her hand resting on the torn envelope. "They wouldn't let Sophia sit in the chair without the $300. Sophia was crying in the lobby. Everyone was looking at her. Dimitri's aunt was sitting right there, Eleni. She saw the whole thing. She had to ask the receptionist what the problem was." "I told Sophia this morning," Eleni said. "I didn't have the money on the card." "So you let her be humiliated?" Sophia's voice cracked. She didn't scream. Her voice was a sharp, trembling whisper, hot with tears. She pulled at one of the metal hair clips, her fingers shaking so much she accidentally pinched her own scalp. Dimitri's aunt asked me if we were having financial trouble, Eleni. She asked me if my father's shop was doing all right. Do you know what that feels like? To have her look at me like I'm some kind of beggar? Eleni turned around. She leaned her lower back against the sink, holding the glass of water with both hands. You paid them. Your father had to drive to the shop, Maria said, her tone heavy with accusation. He had to take the cash from the register, the cash he had set aside to pay the landlord for the water bill and the change he needs for the weekend customers. Now he has nothing in the drawer for tomorrow morning. He's 62 years old, Eleni. He had to run around like a dog because his eldest daughter couldn't be bothered to use her card. The card is at its limit, Eleni said again. You're lying, Sophia spat, her eyes bright with hatred. You just didn't want to do it. You've been acting like this for weeks. You don't want me to marry Dimitri. You want me to be stuck in this house with you, washing dishes until we're both 80? Eleni looked at Sophia's hair. The finished half was intricate, stiff with heavy hairspray, smelling of synthetic vanilla. The unfinished half looked thin, fragile. She calculated her own metabolic expenditure. If she argued, if she showed them the credit card statements, if she pointed out that the cash Spiros took from the register was actually her own money that she had deposited into the business account last month to keep the electricity from being cut, they would not hear her. They would only find another way to twist the narrative until Eleni was the villain of the story. So she said nothing. She took another sip of her water. In the living room, the low gray light of the television flickered against the wall. Spiros was sitting in his green vinyl recliner, his head resting against the back, his eyes closed. He looked small, gray, and incredibly old. He hadn't washed the dry cleaning dye from his hands. His knuckles were stained a deep, permanent purple-black. The linen showcases tomorrow, Maria said, her voice dropping into a flat, exhausted drone. The Vardas family has rented the private pavilion at the Botanical Gardens for the afternoon. The florist is supposed to bring the hydrangea arch mock-up. We have to approve the table settings. She looked up at Eleni, her eyes dark with a silent, heavy demand. We need to make sure everything is perfect, Eleni. Your father will be at the shop all day trying to make up the cash he lost this morning. I need you to drive us, and you need to call the florist. Sophia said she got an email about the deposit. Eleni set her glass of water down on the counter. The glass made a soft, wet clink against the laminate. I'll drive you, Eleni said quietly. Sophia let out a short, wet sniff, turning her head away to look at her reflection in her phone screen. Don't bother. If you're going to act like a martyr the whole time, I'd rather take the bus. Sophia, stop, Maria muttered, her hand reaching out to touch her younger daughter's arm. She'll drive us. She's your sister. Eleni didn't answer. She walked toward the stairs, her feet moving silently across the worn carpet of the hallway. She knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. She knew the florist would not have the white hydrangeas. She knew the Botanical Gardens pavilion would be filled with the Vardas family, all of them dressed in their expensive tailored linens, expecting a display of wealth and sophistication. And she knew, with a cold, absolute certainty, that she would be there to watch the illusion crack. The passenger side door panel of the Honda Civic had a loose plastic clip that rattled every time the car exceeded 40 miles per hour. It was a high, dry, plastic vibration. Buzz-tack, that filled the small cabin, competing with the heavy, rhythmic hum of the highway tires. It was 11:15 a.m. on Saturday. Eleni kept her eyes fixed on the gray ribbon of the interstate. Her hands, clad in thin, black wool gloves with worn fingertips, gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2. Beside her, Maria sat with her knees pressed together, her best black coat zipped up to her chin. The fake fur collar of the coat was slightly matted from being stored in the back of the closet, smelling faintly of cedar shavings and mothballs. In the back seat, Sophia was a storm of static energy. The scent of her jasmine perfume, an expensive French brand Dimitri's mother had gifted her, was thick, sweet, and suffocating in the enclosed space. She had her vanity mirror down, using a small foam wedge to blend a line of foundation near her jawline. "Eleni, can you turn the heater down?" Sophia asked, her voice tight with irritation. "It's blowing directly on my face. My skin is going to dry out before we even get to the pavilion." Eleni reached out, her finger catching the rough edge of the plastic slider, and nudged it to the left. The dry, dusty rush of warm air faded, replaced by the cold, damp draft that seeped through the dry, rotted rubber seal of the driver's side window. "Did you call the florist back?" Maria asked, her voice low, her eyes staring straight ahead at the brake lights of the SUV in front of them. "I told you to call them yesterday afternoon before they closed." "They were busy with weekend deliveries, Ma," Eleni said. It was a partial truth. She had seen the missed call from the florist's billing manager at 4:30 p.m. yesterday, but she had let it ring, watching the screen light up on her desk until it went silent. "They better have everything ready," Sophia muttered from the back, the tack-tack-tack of her long acrylic nails against her phone screen resuming. Mrs. Vardas said she invited her interior designer friend Helen to look at the hydrangea arch. Helen did the flowers for the Greek consulate gala last spring. If the arch looks thin, she'll notice immediately. "It won't look thin," Maria said, though her hand went instinctively to her gold-plated necklace, her fingers twisting the heavy links. "The package we chose is the premium one. Eleni paid the deposit. Right, Eleni?" Eleni did not answer immediately. She watched a semi-truck pass them on the left, its massive tires throwing up a fine gray spray of dirty highway water that splattered across her windshield. She activated the wipers. The rubber blades were old. They left 3 wide, blurry streaks directly across her line of sight. "Eleni?" Maria prompted, her tone sharpening. "The transfer was scheduled," Eleni said. She did not specify the date. She did not mention that scheduled did not mean cleared. She did not explain that Evergreen Floral Designs had a strict automated system that flagged accounts with pending weekend transactions. "Good," Maria sighed, her shoulders dropping half an inch. "As long as it's done. We cannot have any mistakes today. The Vardas family, they are very particular about the details. Dimitri's father has 3 cousins who are judges in Athens. They are very educated people." Sophia let out a soft, satisfied hum from the back seat. "Dimitri said his father is bringing a bottle of 20-year-old Assyrtiko wine from his private cellar for us to taste. We're going to use it for the head table." The car ride lapsed back into silence, save for the rattle in the door panel. Bzz-tack, bzz-tack. Eleni monitored the dashboard. The fuel needle was hovering just above the red line now. She had $15 of gas in the tank, which would get them to the botanical gardens and back to the house, but not a mile further. Her hand throbbed slightly, a dull, deep ache in her thumb joint from the hours she had spent typing billing codes at the clinic. At 11:45 a.m., they turned off the highway and entered the gates of the botanical gardens. The estate was magnificent, even in the damp chill of late spring. Thick, manicured hedges of English yew lined the winding gravel driveway, and the massive glass dome of the conservatory rose against the gray sky like a giant frozen bubble. The parking lot near the private pavilion was already filled with dark, polished European sedans, black Mercedes, silver BMWs, and a single, pristine, champagne-colored Porsche. Eleni steered her Honda toward the drop-off circle in front of the pavilion. The building was a beautiful neoclassical stone structure with white columns and high arched windows that looked out over the sunken rose gardens. As she neared the entrance, 3 valets in matching red vests stood waiting by the stone steps. Eleni pressed her foot against the brake pedal. Screech! The noise was sudden, deafening, and incredibly sharp, a dry, metal-on-metal howl that echoed off the stone columns of the pavilion and vibrated through the damp air. A group of well-dressed guests standing near the entrance, including an elegant older woman in a cream wool cape, turned their heads in unison, their faces twisting in mild alarm and distaste. Sophia let out a low, horrified gasp in the back seat. "Eleni, stop! Oh my God, stop!" Eleni kept her foot on the pedal, letting the car roll to a slow, agonizing halt directly in front of the valet stand, the screech descending into a series of short, dying staccato squeals. Squeak, squeak, squeak. Maria's face was bright red. She didn't wait for the valet to open her door. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a frantic hand, grabbed her purse, and pushed the door open, stepping out onto the wet gravel before the car had completely settled. "Drive it away," Maria whispered through the open window, her eyes darting nervously toward the guests on the steps. "Go park it in the back lot, Eleni. Don't let the valet touch it, just go." Sophia hurried out behind her mother, her face burning, her oversized sunglasses pushed up onto her head as she tried to smooth down her linen dress. She didn't look back at the car. She walked quickly up the stone steps, her high heels clicking softly, her head held stiffly as she greeted Dimitri's aunt with a strained, high-pitched laugh. Eleni sat in the idling car. One of the young valets walked up to her window, looking at the rusted wheel wells of the Honda with a mixture of pity and professional indifference. "Self-park, ma'am?" he asked gently. "Self-park," Eleni said. She rolled the window back up, shifted the car into first gear, and drove toward the gravel lot at the far end of the gardens, her front brakes letting out one last, quiet whimper as she turned the corner. She parked in the shadow of a large compost bin near the maintenance shed, completely out of sight of the pavilion. She turned off the engine. The rattle in the door panels stopped. The silence of the garden rushed in, heavy, cold, and still. She took off her wool gloves, placed them in her lap, and looked at her phone. No new messages. She opened her purse, pulled out a small, pocket-sized mirror, and looked at her reflection. She didn't adjust her hair. She didn't apply lipstick. She simply looked at her own pale, quiet eyes before locking the phone and tucking it away. She stepped out of the car, closed the heavy door with a solid metallic thud, and began the long walk back toward the stone pavilion, her flat, sensible work shoes sinking slightly into the wet, dark gravel. The double oak doors of the garden pavilion were heavy, damp swollen, and required a firm push to open. As Eleni stepped inside, the chill of the gravel path was instantly replaced by the thick, warm humidity of the conservatory air, which smelled of wet soil, forced lilies, and the sharp, clean scent of expensive floor polish. It was 12:02 p.m. The pavilion's main hall was a circular room with a soaring glass dome that looked out over the gray, mist-covered pine trees of the northern gardens. Under the center of the dome, a long rectangular table had been set up to showcase the linen options. It was draped in a heavy ivory damask cloth that fell in deep, stiff folds to the parquet floor. Around the table stood the Vardis family. Mrs. Helen Vardis was 60, but she carried her shoulders with the rigid military posture of a woman who had never known a financial draft. She wore a tailored taupe wool suit, 3 strands of heavy, cream-colored pearls nesting in the hollow of her throat, and her short gray hair was styled with a shellac-like spray that didn't move even in the damp drafts of the room. Beside her stood Dmitri, looking tall and slightly bored in his dark blue blazer, his fingers tracing the edge of his silver watch. Sophia and Maria were standing on the opposite side of the table, their backs to the arched windows. They looked small, their shoulders tense, their eyes darting constantly between Mrs. Vardas's face and the center of the table. Eleni did not join them at the table. She walked slowly toward the perimeter of the room, taking a seat on a low green velvet bench that sat in the shadow of a massive potted fiddle-leaf fig. She pulled her black wool gloves from her hands, folded them neatly, and placed them inside her purse. "The linen is acceptable, Sophia," Mrs. Vardas was saying, her voice carrying that light, musical cadence of the educated Athenian elite, a tone that sounded polite but felt like a cold needle. "But the centerpiece, surely this is not the scale we agreed upon at the tasting." In the center of the ivory damask table sat the mock-up. It was a small, wire-framed dome. Instead of the massive, overflowing cascade of white hydrangeas and pale green eucalyptus Sophia had spent 3 weeks describing to her friends, the frame was covered in a sparse, thin layer of flat salal leaves and 6 tight, cheap white carnations that looked as though they had been purchased from a supermarket bucket. It looked like a funeral tribute for a small pet. Sophia's face was the color of unbaked dough. She was clutching her leather clutch so tightly that the gold chain was biting into her palm. There must be a misunderstanding," Sophia stammered, her voice shaking slightly as she looked toward the young woman in the black blazer who stood by the service door, the florist's coordinator holding a black leather clipboard. We ordered the premium hydrangea arch with the matching table cascades." The florist's coordinator stepped forward, her flat leather flats making a soft, rubbery squeak on the polished wood. She had a polite, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sophia," the coordinator said, her voice clear, carrying easily across the high-ceilinged room. "Our billing office attempted to reach you yesterday afternoon. As per our standard contract, the premium hydrangea shipments are imported directly from our growers in Holland. We require cleared funds 48 hours prior to delivery for all custom floral imports." "But the deposit was paid," Maria said, her voice rising, her hand going to her neck. She looked toward Eleni, her eyes dark with a sudden frantic panic. The money was sent on Friday." "The transfer was initiated on Friday morning, yes," the coordinator explained, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "But our bank flags all weekend transactions from personal lines of credit. The funds are currently listed as pending and will not clear our account until Monday morning. Since we could not secure the grower's invoice by the Friday 5 o'clock deadline, our warehouse could only release the basic greenery mock-up for today's showcase." Mrs. Vardas let out a soft, dry chuckle. It was a tiny sound, like a dry leaf falling on concrete, but it made Sophia flinch. "Pending," Mrs. Vardas murmured, her eyes drifting from the sparse green leaves on the table to Maria's face, then to the gold-plated jewelry around Maria's neck. "How very unusual. I thought the billing was handled weeks ago." Dmitri's aunt, Helen, who had been standing near the window, turned around, her silk scarf whispering against her collar. "It's a shame. The white hydrangeas would have brought out the silver in the damask. Now it looks rather sparse, doesn't it, Dmitri?" Dmitri looked at his phone, then looked at the table. "It's fine, Aunt Helen. It's just flowers." "It's not just flowers, Dmitri," Mrs. Vardas corrected him, her voice dropping into a cold, quiet register that carried the weight of generations of social judgment. "The flowers are the first thing people see when they enter the pavilion. If the tables look empty, people will think we couldn't manage the details. It reflects on the family." She turned her head slowly, her gaze crossing the room until it landed on Eleni, who was sitting quietly on the velvet bench, her hands resting in her lap. "Eleni, dear," Mrs. Vardas said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "You manage your father's books, don't you? Surely you know how these banking transfers work. Why would you let the florist's deadline pass without securing the funds?" Sophia turned her head, her face twisted in a look of raw, venomous rage as she stared at her older sister. "Yes, Eleni. Why didn't you make sure it cleared?" Eleni looked at the three of them. Mrs. Vardas, with her pearls and her cold, assessing eyes. Sophia, whose vanity had just been stripped bare in front of her future in-laws. And Maria, who looked as though she might faint from the sheer social humiliation of the moment. She felt a deep, immense stillness. She did not apologize. She did not explain that her account had been locked to protect her own life, or that she had spent her 20s paying for their illusions. "The transfer was scheduled," Eleni said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and perfectly clear. "The bank has its own schedule. I cannot change the rules of the bank." Mrs. Vardas's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized the tone. It was the tone of a person who was not afraid of her, a person who had quietly stepped outside the circle of her influence. "I see," Mrs. Vardas said, her voice turning icy. She turned back to Sophia, her smile returning like a thin sheet of winter ice. "Well, dear, perhaps we should look at the silver options instead. We can only hope the main wedding checks don't have the same pending status next week." Sophia didn't answer. She looked down at the floor, her hands shaking, her bottom lip trembling as she tried to swallow the tears of humiliation that were rising in her throat. Eleni sat in the shadow of the fig tree, her hand resting on her purse. She watched the coordinator mark something on her clipboard with a sharp black check mark. The first major crack had appeared in the wall, and the house had not fallen on her. The silence on the 3-mile drive back from the botanical gardens was different from the silence on the way there. It was no longer the tense, expectant quiet of people preparing for a performance. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a theater after the lights had failed mid-scene. It was 2:45 p.m. on Saturday. In the back seat, Sophia lay curled against the door panel, her cheek pressed against the cold glass of the window. Her oversized sunglasses were back on, but they couldn't hide the wet, dark tracks of mascara that had smeared down her cheeks, turning her foundation a dull, muddy gray. She didn't text. Her phone lay face down on the seat beside her, its screen dark. Maria sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripped so tightly around her black vinyl purse that the cheap metal clasp was bent slightly out of shape. She stared straight ahead, her breathing shallow and ragged. Every time Eleni pressed the brake pedal, the front brakes let out that high metallic shriek, and Maria's shoulders would jerk, as if she were being struck by a physical blow. Eleni kept her speed at exactly 35 miles per hour. She felt nothing, no panic, no guilt, no desire to fill the empty air with explanations. She simply monitored the road, her hands loose and relaxed on the worn rubber of the steering wheel. When they finally pulled into the narrow driveway of the house, Spiros's delivery van was already there. Spiros was sitting on the wooden steps of the front porch, still wearing his grease-stained work apron. He had a half-smoked cigarette between his stained fingers, the thin blue smoke rising straight up into the damp, stagnant air. He didn't look up as the car stopped. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped forward, his eyes fixed on a small crack in the concrete walkway. Maria pushed her door open before the engine had fully died. She didn't look at Eleni. She hurried up the walkway, her heels clicking softly, and began speaking to Spiros in a low, frantic whisper before she even reached the porch. Sophia followed her, her head bowed, her cream linen dress wrinkled from the car ride. She walked past her father without a word, her slippers dragging on the wood as she disappeared into the dark hallway of the house. Eleni sat in the car for a moment. She turned off the ignition, pulled the key from the slot, and listened to the soft, ticking sound of the engine cooling down in the damp air. She climbed out of the car, carrying her black vinyl purse, and walked up the steps. Spiros didn't move his legs to let her pass. He sat with his knees wide, blocking the center of the steps. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her through the smoke. "The florist," Spiros said, his voice gravelly, dry. "Your mother says you embarrassed Sophia in front of Helen Vardas." Eleni stood on the step below him. She looked down at his stained leather work boots. "The florist required cleared funds, Papa. I told Sophia that on Tuesday." "You are the eldest," Spiros said, his voice rising slightly, though it lacked its usual thunder. It sounded hollow, like an old tin can rolling down a hill. "Your job is to take care of your sister. If the money was not there, you should have found it. You have the clinic job. You have your savings." "My savings are gone, Papa," Eleni said. Her voice was very quiet, very steady. "I spent the last of them on the venue down payment 3 weeks ago. You know this." Spiros took another drag of his cigarette, then threw the butt onto the gravel driveway, where it let out a tiny hiss in the wet grass. He didn't look at her again. He stood up, his knees making that dry, cracking sound, and walked into the house, slamming the screen door behind him. Eleni walked inside, climbed the stairs to her bedroom, and locked the door behind her. She did not turn on the light. She walked to the small closet in the corner, reached into the very back behind her winter coats, and pulled out a white leather accordion file folder. She sat on the edge of her bed, placing the folder in her lap. This folder was her ledger. Inside were the printed copies of every contract she had signed for Sophia's wedding over the last 6 months. She pulled out the first document, the Grand Pavilion Event Lease Agreement. She turned to the signature page. There were only 2 signatures on the line for lessee, Eleni Georgiou. Below it, the line for her father's name was blank. The venue's legal department had refused to accept Spiros as a co-signer because of his outstanding tax liens. Sophia's name was not on the document either. She had no income, no credit history, and no legal assets. Eleni ran her finger over the black ink of her signature. She pulled out the next document, Oasis Catering, Service Contract. Again, her signature was the only one on the primary guarantor line. She pulled out the contract for the florist, the band, the custom lighting company, and the linen rental service. Every single one of them had her name listed as the primary billing contact and the sole financial guarantor. She opened her laptop, booted it up, and logged into her personal bank account portal. She clicked on the Services tab, then clicked on Stop Payment on Checks. The interface was simple, clean, and modern. A series of empty text boxes appeared on the screen. Check number, payee name, amount, reason for stop payment. She had already written the post-dated checks for the final payments, checks that were currently sitting in the safe at the bridal salon, the catering office, and the venue's billing department, scheduled to be deposited on the Monday morning after the wedding reception. Total amount, $26,450. Eleni looked at the screen. The white light of the monitor reflected in her eyes, casting two tiny, bright squares of light onto her pupils. If she clicked the Submit button on those stop payment requests, the checks would be flagged instantly by the clearinghouse. When the vendors attempted to deposit them, the bank would reject them with a Stop Payment Auth code. The funds would remain in her account, and the vendors would be left with useless pieces of paper. According to the bank's terms of service, she could initiate a stop payment online up to 24 hours after the check was presented, but she could also pre-register the stop payment orders weeks in advance. She didn't enter the numbers yet. She wasn't ready to pull the trigger. She closed her laptop, set it on her desk, and put the contracts back into the white accordion folder. She sat in the quiet, dark room, listening to the muffled sounds of the house below. She could hear the low, rhythmic rumble of her father's television in the living room and the occasional sharp clatter of her mother moving pots in the kitchen. They were still angry. They were still planning how to fix the embarrassment of the florist. They were likely calculating how much cash they could borrow from Spiros's brother in Astoria to cover the difference before next weekend. They had no idea that the floor beneath their feet had already been cut away. They were still standing on the air, held up only by the weight of their own expectations. Eleni lay back on her bed, her head resting on her thin pillow, her eyes tracking the slow, silent gray of the afternoon fading into twilight. On Sunday mornings, the radio in the kitchen was always tuned to the cathedral in the city. The liturgy was broadcast at a low, scratchy volume, the nasal drone of the cantor's voice filtering through the floorboards of the house like a persistent metallic hum. It was 8:15 a.m. Eleni sat at her small wooden desk in the corner of her bedroom. The room was cold. The radiator let out a single dying hiss before going silent. On her laptop screen, the online banking portal was open to the profile settings page. Her fingers clicked the mouse with a soft plastic sound. Primary mailing address. She deleted the street address of her family's house, the narrow, two-story brick building where she had lived her entire life. In its place, she typed P.O. Box 402, Northside Station, NY 11104. She had rented the small metal box on her lunch break on Friday, paying the $50 6-month fee in cash. By changing her address now, she was ensuring that every physical notification, every overdraft alert, every stop payment confirmation, every high-interest credit card statement would bypass the kitchen counter entirely. There would be no white envelopes with red window film sitting under the bread box for her mother to discover. She clicked Save Profile. A small green check mark appeared on the screen. Your address change has been processed successfully. Please allow 3 to 5 business days for mail redirection. Eleni closed the laptop lid. The screen went dark, her reflection disappearing from the black plastic bezel. She stood up and walked to her closet. For Sunday service, her mother expected her to wear something respectable, a dark blue or patterned dress that looked appropriate for a girl of her age who was still waiting for her turn. Instead, Eleni reached for a plain, charcoal gray wool long-sleeved dress. It was old, the hem slightly frayed at the back seam, and it had no lace, no gold buttons, and no embroidery. It was a dress designed to disappear into the shadows of the church pews. When she came downstairs, the smell of livani, the sweet, heavy frankincense her mother burned on a small charcoal disc in the hallway, was thick in the air, mixing with the greasy scent of fried eggs and butter. Maria was standing in the dining room, holding a handheld fabric steamer. She was dragging the plastic head of the steamer down the sleeve of Sophia's white lace church dress, which hung from the chandelier. Billows of hot, damp steam rose around her face, making her dyed black hair curl tightly at her temples. "The Vardas family will be there by 9, Maria said without looking at Eleni. She pressed the steamer against a stubborn wrinkle near the collar. "Dimitri's mother told me they always sit on the left side, near the icon of St. Nicholas. We need to be there before them. We cannot be seen dragging our feet into the narthex." Sophia was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and heavily powdered to hide the puffiness around her eyes from yesterday's tears. She was holding a small, silver-rimmed teacup, her fingers tracing the delicate handle. She didn't look at Eleni. "Eleni, go get the gold earrings from my jewelry box," Maria ordered, her voice carrying the high, breathless tone of Sunday morning panic. "The ones with the small pearls. You need to wear something on your ears. You look like a widow in that gray dress." Eleni walked to the kitchen counter. She poured herself a half cup of black coffee from the pot. The coffee had been sitting on the burner for an hour. It was thick, burnt, and smelled of scorched glass. "The gray dress is fine, Ma," Eleni said. "It's not fine," Maria snapped, setting the steamer down on the dining table with a sharp clunk. "You are 31, Eleni. People in the parish already talk. They ask me why the eldest is always looking like she's going to a funeral, while the younger sister is marrying into the best family in the community. You want them to think we don't buy you clothes? You want them to think we are poor?" Eleni took a slow sip of her coffee. The burnt liquid coated her tongue, bitter and hot. She calculated her father's presence. Spiros was still in his room, the bathroom door locked as he shaved. She could hear the rhythmic scraping of his razor against his skin, a wet, metallic sound that signaled he would be downstairs in exactly 5 minutes. "I'll put the earrings in my purse," Eleni said quietly. "Just put them on," Sophia muttered from the kitchen table, her voice raw and dry. "Don't start an argument today, Eleni. My head is splitting. If Mrs. Vardas looks at me with that pitying look again today, I'm going to scream." "She won't look at you that way," Maria said instantly, her voice softening as she turned to her younger daughter, her hand reaching out to smooth the lace of the hanging dress. "Your father talked to Uncle George last night. George is going to lend us the 1,500 for the florist. We will pay the florist on Monday morning, and the flowers will be perfect for the reception. It was just a small mistake, a banking error. Everyone has them." Eleni looked at the white lace dress hanging from the chandelier. The steam was slowly condensing on the delicate fabric, forming tiny, clear water droplets that clung to the threads like dew on a spider's web. Uncle George, Spiros's brother, who ran a small, struggling fish market in Astoria. George had 4 children of his own and a mortgage he had refinanced twice. The $1,500 he was lending them was likely his property tax money, taken from a drawer in his kitchen out of some deep ancestral sense of family obligation. And it would be entirely wasted. Even if the $1,500 cleared on Monday, it would only cover the florist. It would not cover the caterer's final invoice, which was due on Tuesday. It would not cover the venue's balance, which was due on Wednesday. Eleni dried her coffee cup on the kitchen towel, her hand moving in a slow, circular motion. "I'll go start the car," Eleni said. "Don't let it make that noise," Sophia cried, her hand flying to her forehead. "Please, Eleni, if it screeches in the church parking lot, I'll die. Just don't park near the entrance." "I'll park on the street," Eleni said. She picked up her purse from the counter, walked out of the back door, and stepped into the cold, damp morning air. The mist had turned into a fine, needle-like drizzle that settled on her skin like cold dust. She climbed into her Honda Civic, turned the key, and listened to the slow, heavy crank of the starter. It took 4 long, agonizing groans before the engine finally caught, the idle rough and shaking the dashboard. She sat in the vibrating cabin, watching the rain form tiny, perfect circles on the hood of the car. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and checked her email. There was a confirmation notification from her bank. Address change request received. Your records have been updated. Eleni slowly slipped the phone back into the dark, zippered pocket of her bag. She didn't put the pearl earrings on. She left them in the bottom of her purse, rolling around in the dark among the loose quarters and old grocery receipts. The church basement smelled of damp concrete, stale filter coffee, and the sweet almond scent of Curabiede's cookies left on paper plates. It was 12:15 p.m. on Sunday. A low ceiling of acoustic tiles, yellowed around old water pipes, trapped the roar of 100 voices. Parish coffee hour was in full swing. Elderly women in black wool coats gathered near the pastry tables. Children in stiff suits darted between metal folding chairs, their leather soles squeaking against the red linoleum floor. Eleni stood beside a concrete pillar, holding a white paper cup of lukewarm tea. She hadn't added sugar or lemon. She simply held the cup to warm her hands, still cold from the drafty sanctuary upstairs. 20 feet away, Maria and Sophia stood with Mrs. Helen Vardas and two of her sisters. It was only a minor synchronization error with the commercial ledger, Maria said, raising her voice above the noise. She gave a light wave of her hand, her gold bracelets chiming together. Spiros has the premium account, you see. When the branch manager flagged the weekend hold, we simply had the accountant handle it directly. The florist even called this morning to apologize. Mrs. Vardas listened with her chin slightly raised. Her eyes moved carefully across Maria's face. She sipped coffee from a ceramic cup brought down from the parish council room upstairs. The paper cups were for everyone else. Of course, Mrs. Vardas replied smoothly. These modern systems are dreadfully complicated. Dimitri's father always says that without a private banker, you're at the mercy of the machine. She paused. But as long as the hydrangeas are secured, Helen, the designer, was quite concerned. She said a thin arch makes the altar look like a provincial chapel. Sophia smiled, though her lips looked dry beneath her pale lipstick. It will be perfect, Mrs. Vardas. The grower confirmed the shipment is already on its way from Holland. Eleni lowered her gaze to her phone. Turning her back to the group, she used the concrete pillar to shield the screen. An email from Oak Ridge Property Management was open. Dear Eleni, we are pleased to inform you that your application for the one-bedroom unit at 1420 42nd Street, Apartment 3B, has been approved. To finalize the lease and secure the keys for the Friday, June 19th move-in date, please review the attached contract and submit the electronic transfer for the first month's rent, $1,200, and the security deposit, $1,200, by 5 p.m. today. Eleni scrolled to the bottom of the lease. The apartment was small and plain. A third-floor walk-up, only 3 blocks from the physical therapy clinic. No park view, no stainless steel appliances, no dishwasher. But it had a heavy deadbolt on the door and a window overlooking a quiet, tree-lined alley. She tapped the signature field. With her fingertip, she wrote her initials, E.G. Then she opened her banking app. Her remaining savings totaled exactly $2,500. Money hidden in an old secondary account that her father's accountant had never discovered. Originally, it had been reserved for Sophia's wedding. The custom embroidered guest book, the raw silk bridesmaid shawls, the imported almond favors. Instead, she selected direct wire. She entered Oak Ridge Property Management's routing number. Amount, $2,400. Send. The phone vibrated once in her hand. A single pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Transaction approved. Reference number 00982-A. Funds transferred successfully. Eleni locked the phone. With that single tap, her liquid savings had dropped to $100. But she had bought something far more valuable: an exit. On Friday, June 19th, the afternoon before the wedding, she would load her small car with 5 pairs of scrubs, her books, and her winter coats. Then she would drive to 42nd Street. She would lock the door behind her, and she would never return to the house with its clanking radiators and the lingering smell of lamb fat. "Eleni, dear." Mrs. Vardas's voice sounded directly behind her. Eleni turned. She didn't panic. The phone disappeared into her dress pocket. Her face remained calm and unreadable. Mrs. Vardas stood there holding her half-empty coffee cup with both hands. Sharp eyes traveled over Eleni's plain gray dress and bare ears. "You seem very quiet today," Mrs. Vardas said softly. "Sophia tells me you've been working hard at the clinic. 60 hours a week, is it?" "Yes." "A good girl," Mrs. Vardas murmured. Her lips never smiled. "But a girl must be careful not to spend all her youth in an office. A woman's real work is the home. Stay away too long and she becomes difficult, unused to the compromises of family life." She leaned closer. Lavender perfume and face powder drifted toward Eleni. "Sophia is very young. She is soft. She needs to know her sister is supporting her, not creating administrative complications." Mrs. Vardas's voice hardened. "We are very proud people, Eleni. The Vardas name does not tolerate disorganization." Eleni looked at the woman's pearl necklace. In the center pearl, she could see her own reflection, tiny, distorted. "We all have our work, Mrs. Vardas," she said evenly. Mrs. Vardas stared at her. For a long moment, she searched for a crack, a flash of resentment, an apology. She found neither. Finally, she gave a small, tight nod and walked away, her heels clicking sharply across the linoleum. Eleni lifted her tea and took a slow sip. It tasted faintly of wax and cheap paper. Across the room, Sophia laughed at something Dimitri's aunt had said. Her head tipped back. One hand rested lightly against her chest. She looked confident, certain that her place in the world was secure, certain that the ground beneath her feet would always remain warm and solid. Eleni watched her quietly. In her mind, she could already feel the cool weight of the apartment key she would collect in 5 days. The late afternoon sun of mid-June filtered through Eleni's dusty window pane, casting long, pale amber slats of light across her wooden floorboards. It was 4:30 p.m. on Sunday. Eleni stood in front of her closet, her movements slow, deliberate, and perfectly silent. Her bedroom shared a thin plaster wall with Sophia's, and she could hear the muffled, high-pitched chatter of a wedding podcast playing from her sister's tablet next door. To avoid making any noise that would alert her family, Eleni had decided against cardboard boxes or heavy brown packing tape. The ripping sound of tape, screech, screech, was too distinctive, too violent for a quiet Sunday afternoon. Instead, she used her old high school canvas backpack and a large black nylon gym bag she had kept in the back of the closet since her college days. She wrapped her most personal belongings in her heavy winter sweaters, her cotton scrub tops, and her thick flannel pajamas. First went her documents. She slid her birth certificate, her social security card, her nursing school transcripts, and her physical therapy manager certification into a thick plastic folder. She packed them flat against the bottom of the gym bag, covering them with a layer of dark green scrubs. Next were her books. She didn't have many, mostly old dental hygiene manuals, clinical billing guides, and 3 paperback novels with creased spines. She wrapped each book individually in a soft cotton t-shirt to prevent the paper edges from sliding against the nylon bag. Her grandmother's small porcelain clock was the last item. It was a delicate, hand-painted piece with tiny pink roses around the dial, the only thing her grandmother had brought with her from the village. Eleni wrapped it in 3 layers of thick wool socks, nesting it safely in the very center of the gym bag between 2 heavy sweaters. She zipped the bag. The metal zipper let out a tiny metallic hiss in the quiet room. She stood up, her back cracking slightly from the effort of bending over. She looked at her room. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. The bed was made, her dresser still had her hairbrush and her half-empty bottle of cheap lotion on it. Her coat still hung from the peg. She was leaving behind the heavy furniture, the old curtains, and the desk, things she had not bought and did not want. "Eleni!" Maria's voice rose from the bottom of the stairs, sharp and carrying the heavy physical strain of Sunday evening chore preparation. "Eleni, come down! Your father is at the table. He wants to go over the hotel invoices before the bank opens tomorrow morning." Eleni took a deep, quiet breath. She picked up the black gym bag by its woven handles. It was heavy, weighing perhaps 20 pounds, the strap cutting slightly into her palm. She opened her bedroom door, stepped out into the hallway, and walked down the stairs, carrying the bag at her side. As she reached the bottom, Maria was walking out of the kitchen, holding a damp dishcloth. She stopped, her eyes dropping instantly to the black gym bag in Eleni's hand. "What is that?" Maria asked, her brow furrowing in mild suspicion. "My old gym clothes," Eleni said, her voice flat, level, and empty of any defensive tension. "And the towels from the clinic. I need to take them to the laundromat near the highway. The dryer downstairs is leaving grease marks on the whites." Maria looked at the bag for a long second. In her mind, Eleni was the laundry coordinator, the person who solved the household's domestic malfunctions. The idea that Eleni was packing her life away simply didn't exist in the vocabulary of their home. "The dryer is fine," Maria muttered, her suspicion dissolving instantly into her usual irritation. "You just don't clean the lint trap properly. Put the bag by the door and come to the dining room. Your father has been waiting 10 minutes. "I'll put it in my car first," Eleni said, "so I don't forget it in the morning." She walked past her mother, opened the back door, and stepped out onto the concrete steps. The air was cool and damp, the scent of the neighbor's blooming lilacs mixing with the exhaust of a passing car on the main street. She walked down the driveway to her Honda Civic. She unlocked the trunk with her physical key, the metal lock turning with a heavy, dry clack. She lifted the lid, placed the black gym bag next to her spare tire and the rusty jack, and closed the trunk softly. She stood in the driveway for a moment, her fingers curled around the cold metal of her key ring. 1 bag was in. 5 more days. When she walked back into the dining room, Spiros was sitting at the table, his reading glasses pushed down onto the bridge of his nose. He was surrounded by 3 separate piles of paper, the dry cleaning invoices, the municipal water notices, and a thick yellowed ledger from his accountant. "Eleni, look at this," Spiros said, his thick finger tapping a white paper on the table. "The hotel in Long Island. They are saying they didn't receive the linen delivery for the Memorial Day weekend. They are holding the $3,000 payment until we send the signed receipts from the driver." Eleni sat in the chair opposite him. She didn't pull her chair in. She sat on the edge of the seat, her hands resting flat on the dark wood of the table. "The driver was Uncle George's son, Papa," Eleni said quietly. "He didn't get the signature. He left the bags on the loading dock because he was in a hurry. Spiros let out a low, rumbling groan, his fist clenching on the table. A fool, a lazy boy. Now the bank won't extend the line of credit because of the outstanding balances. Eleni, we need that $3,000 for the wedding reception hall deposit by Wednesday. If the hotel payment doesn't clear, where do we get the money? He looked up at her, his eyes dark, heavy, and expectant. He didn't ask her for a loan. He simply waited for her to present the solution, as she had done a dozen times before. Eleni calculated her response. Today was Sunday. Her clinic paycheck would be deposited on Friday morning. She had no intention of transferring a single dollar to his account. The direct deposit from the clinic clears on Friday morning, Papa, Eleni said, keeping her voice neutral, professional. I'll see what the balance looks like then. Spiros's shoulders relaxed slightly, his chest rising as he let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. Friday. Good. The venue manager, Mr. Pappas, he knows me. If I tell him the final check is cleared on Friday morning, he will let us run the reception on Saturday. Just make sure the transfer is done before 9. I'll look at it on Friday, Eleni repeated. She didn't say yes. She didn't promise the money. But to Spiros, her quiet compliance was as certain as the rising sun. He took off his glasses, set them on the ledger, and began to massage his swollen temples with his purple-stained thumbs. Eleni sat in the dim light of the dining room, watching the dust motes swirl in the pale yellow beam of the table lamp. The trap was completely silent. They were already walking into it, step by step, guided only by the heavy, unshakable weight of their own assumptions. The key turned in the glass front door of Northside Physical Therapy with a crisp, brassy click. It was 7:30 a.m. on Monday, June 15, 2026. The clinic was dark and cold, holding the stagnant chill of the weekend. Eleni walked inside, her rubber-soled work shoes silent on the industrial blue carpet. She didn't turn on the main overhead fluorescent banks yet. She preferred the half-light of the morning, when the only illumination came from the pale gray sky filtering through the high, clear-story windows, catching the dust motes that hung suspended over the treatment tables. She set her purse on the desk, walked to the staff break room, and turned on the coffee maker. The machine began its morning sequence, a low, mechanical rumble followed by the slow, hot drip of water through the paper filter, filling the small room with the bitter, comforting scent of roasted chicory. While the coffee brewed, Eleni sat at her desk and booted up her computer. The fan inside the tower started with a soft, high-pitched whine that gradually settled into a steady hum. She opened her personal banking application on her phone. There was a red notification dot hovering over the activity feed. She tapped it. Alert. Automated draft declined. Merchant, Evergreen Floral Designs, LLC. Amount, $4,200. Reason, insufficient funds. Available balance, $112.15. Eleni looked at the screen. She felt no tightness in her chest, no sudden rush of adrenaline. The numbers were exact, clean, and final. By transferring the $2,400 to the property management company yesterday for her new apartment, she had left her account empty. The florist's automated billing system had run the transaction at exactly 6 a.m. as scheduled, and the bank's computer had automatically rejected it. At 8:05 a.m., the main clinic phone began to ring. Eleni picked up her mug of black coffee, took a slow sip, and reached for the receiver, pressing the button for line 1. Northside Physical Therapy, Eleni speaking. Hi, Eleni. This is Sarah from Evergreen Floral Designs. The woman's voice was hurried, accompanied by the background clatter of wire shears and the high, wet squeak of flower stems being pulled from plastic buckets. I'm calling about the rescheduled deposit for the Giorgio Vardas wedding this Saturday. Yes, Sarah, Eleni said, her voice even and calm. Our system ran the credit card this morning, but it was declined for insufficient funds, Sarah said, her tone professional but holding a slight defensive edge. We have the Dutch importer on the other line right now. The white hydrangeas are sitting in the refrigerated warehouse at JFK, but if we don't clear the balance and authorize the release by 9 o'clock, the distributor is going to sell the batch to an event designer in Manhattan. We need a certified wire or a different credit card immediately. Eleni rested her elbow on the desk, her fingers lightly touching the edge of her coffee mug. She looked out the window at the brick fire escape across the street, where a pigeon was slowly preening its feathers in the damp morning air. We won't be sending a different card, Sarah, Eleni said. A long pause hung on the line. The background noise on Sarah's end seemed to fade, replaced by a sudden, heavy stillness. I'm sorry, Sarah said, her tone shifting from impatience to genuine confusion. Eleni, if we don't clear the deposit, the hydrangeas will be released. We won't have time to reorder. The arch for the church and the reception centerpieces will have to be made with our standard green salal foliage and white carnations. It will not look like the premium package Sophia approved. I understand, Eleni said. You understand? Sarah stammered. In her 6 years of managing high-end bridal floral accounts in the community, she was used to tears, screaming, demands to speak to managers, and frantic promises of cash. She was not prepared for a quiet, polite acceptance. But the wedding is this Saturday. Sophia was very clear about the hydrangeas. She said, Mrs. Vardas. The basic greenery package is fine, Sarah, Eleni interrupted gently. You can release the hydrangeas to the Manhattan vendor. We will proceed with the greenery and the carnations. Are you sure? Sarah asked, her voice dropping into a low, bewildered whisper. There is no refund on the initial design consultation fee, and the contract cannot be changed after today. I'm sure, Eleni said. Thank you for your call. She hung up the receiver. She set the plastic handset back in its cradle with a soft, clean click. She took another sip of her coffee. It was hot, bitter, and tasted exactly as it should. In her mind, she could see the church altar on Saturday afternoon, the massive, cold stone columns of the sanctuary, the elegant guests in their silk dresses and tailored suits, and the wedding arch, completely bare of the white, overflowing blossoms Sophia had bragged about for 6 months. There would be only the dark, flat green of the cheap salal leaves and the stiff, small carnations, looking like a display in a budget funeral parlor. And Sophia would have to walk directly under it. The door to the clinic opened, the glass rattling slightly as Dr. Kenneth walked in, his heavy coat smelling of cold rain and wet wool. He grunted a brief greeting, his boots squeaking on the carpet as he headed toward his office. Good morning, doctor, Eleni said, her voice cheerful, light. Morning, Eleni, he mumbled, not looking back. Did the Blue Cross authorization come through? I'm on it right now, she said. She opened the physical therapy billing software, her fingers moving across the keyboard with a quick, light speed. Tab, enter, 90210. She was no longer carrying the weight of the wedding. She was no longer the shock absorber for her family's social pride. She was simply a clinic manager, doing her job, earning her hourly wage, and waiting for Friday afternoon to arrive. The first silent trap had snapped shut, and the noise of its closure was entirely beautiful. The dining room table was covered with a sheet of thick, white foam board. It was Monday, 7:45 p.m. Sophia sat with her knees tucked up under her chin on one of the wooden chairs, her fingers holding a small plastic box filled with gold-headed pushpins. Across the board, Dozens of tiny hand-calligraphed paper flags were arranged in neat circular clusters, each circle representing a table at the grand pavilion. Maria stood behind her, wearing her reading glasses on a silver chain around her neck. She held a printed guest list from the Vardis family, her red pen making small, neat check marks next to the names. "Dimitri's aunt said the bishop must be at table 1, Maria murmured, her pen hovering over the paper. "With the consul general and his wife. That's 8 people already. If we put your father and me there, that's 10. The table only holds 10 comfortably." "We can't crowd the bishop, Ma," Sophia said, her voice tight with the intense focus of her task. She picked up a pin and pushed it firmly into the white foam. The plastic tip made a soft, hollow pop as it pierced the paper flag. "Mrs. Vardis said his robes are very heavy. He needs space to move his arms." Eleni stood at the small sideboard near the kitchen door, slowly folding a stack of clean linen napkins she had pulled from the dryer. The fabric was rough, cheap polyester that resisted her attempts to press the edges flat with her palms. She watched her sister's fingers. Sophia was moving the gold pins with a rapid, decisive speed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What about Eleni?" Maria asked. She didn't look toward the sideboard. Her fingers scanned down the G section of the guest list. "We need to place her. She's family." Sophia paused, her hand hovering over table 2, the table designated for the immediate family and the wedding party. She looked at the small white flag that read Eleni Giorgio, then looked at the gold pins already crowding the circle. "Table 2 is completely full, Ma," Sophia said, her voice dropping into a flat, matter-of-fact register. "We have the maid of honor, the 3 bridesmaids, Dimitri's brothers, and their wives. If we put Eleni there, we have to move Dimitri's cousin, Irene. Irene's husband is the one who helped Papa with the lease renewal on the shop. We can't offend them." "Of course not," Maria agreed quickly, her pen making a small, dismissive slash through the margin. "We must keep the Irene table happy, but Eleni has to sit somewhere. People will look." "I was thinking table 12, Sophia said. She picked up the flag with Eleni's name. Without looking up, she pushed the gold pin through the paper and pressed it into the outer edge of the foam board, far from the central circle, under the gold-lettered header, the head table. Table 12 was located at the very back of the pavilion's floor plan, directly adjacent to the double swing doors of the kitchen and the narrow corridor leading to the public restrooms. On the blueprint, it was the table reserved for the service staff, the videographer's assistant, and the elderly, distant relatives who were too deaf to mind the noise of the dishwashers. "Table 12 is very practical," Maria said, her tone softening into that warm, reasonable voice she used when justifying an act of convenience. She turned her head slightly, her eyes finally landing on Eleni's back. "You see, Eleni, since you are so good with the details and you already know Mr. Pappas from the billing office, it will be much easier for you to sit near the kitchen. That way, when the servers are ready to bring out the roast lamb, you can just pop inside and let them know. It won't look strange if you get up from table 12, but if you were at the head table, everyone would notice you moving around." "And honestly, Eleni," Sophia added, her eyes still fixed on her pins, her tone casual, almost generous. "The photographer's package we got only covers the front half of the pavilion. If you're in the back, you don't have to worry about being in the background of the main family portraits. I know how much you hate having your picture taken. You always make that stiff face anyway." Eleni set the folded napkin down on the pile. The fabric let out a soft, dry sigh of air as it settled. She looked at the white foam board. She looked at her name, pinned near the service corridor, right next to the little pencil sketch of the kitchen doors. She calculated her own response. The emotional energy required to feel hurt, to point out that she had paid the deposit on the very table she was being excluded from, to explain that she had spent her entire adult life standing behind them so they could shine. She felt only a cold, beautiful vacuum. "Table 12 is fine, Ma," Eleni said. Maria's face instantly relaxed, a small, relieved smile appearing on her lips. "You see, Sophia? I told you she wouldn't mind. Eleni is always very sensible. She understands how these things have to be balanced." "Yeah," Sophia muttered, already moving on to the placement of Dimitri's college friends. "Just make sure you wear something quiet, Eleni. The gray dress is fine, but maybe don't wear those heavy work shoes. Dimitri's mother is very sensitive to the way the family looks when we walk in." "I'll wear something quiet," Eleni said. She picked up the stack of folded napkins, walked into the kitchen, and placed them in the dark cupboard near the bread box. Through the open window of the kitchen, she could hear the steady, rhythmic drip-drop of the rain falling from the rusted gutter onto the concrete path below. The air was cool, smelling of wet asphalt and cold, wet brick. She reached into her pocket and touched her keys. She had 5 days left in this house. 5 days of folding their linens, listening to their plans, and watching them arrange the pieces of their perfect gilded stage. And on Saturday night, when the music started and the guests took their seats at their designated tables, she would let them discover exactly what happened when the invisible pillar they had built their castle upon simply decided to walk away. The rhythmic, wet clack whir of the office printer was the only sound at the reception desk. It was Tuesday, 11:15 a.m., and the Northside Physical Therapy Clinic was at its mid-morning peak. Eleni sat behind the acrylic sneeze guard, her fingers methodically stapling patient intake sheets. In the waiting area, 3 elderly patients sat in the vinyl chairs, the pages of their sports magazines rustling softly under the hum of the ceiling fan. The air smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and the damp wool of coats drying near the heater. The glass front door did not just open, it was thrown back so hard the brass bell above it struck the ceiling tile with a sharp, metallic clang. Sophia marched into the clinic, her face flushed a dark, angry red under her heavy makeup. She was wearing her oversized sunglasses on top of her head, her silk scarf trailing behind her like a banner. Behind her came Maria, her breathing heavy and shallow, her face tight with a desperate, frantic energy. Sophia didn't stop at the waiting room carpet. She walked straight to the reception desk and slammed her leather clutch onto the counter. The impact made the plastic clipboards rattle on their metal hooks. "How could you?" Sophia's voice was a high, trembling shriek that instantly cut through the quiet hum of the clinic. In the waiting room, the 3 elderly patients looked up in unison, their magazines freezing mid-turn. Eleni did not stand up. She finished stapling the intake sheet in her hand, placed it neatly on the stack, and looked up at her sister through the small opening at the bottom of the acrylic barrier. Her face was perfectly still. "Sophia, I am at work," Eleni said, her voice a low, level whisper. "Please lower your voice." "I don't care about your stupid job," Sophia shouted, her hands gripping the top of the acrylic partition, her long nails scraping against the plastic. "The florist just called me, Sarah. She said you canceled the hydrangeas. She said you told her the greenery was fine. She said the Dutch shipment is already gone, sold to someone else." Dr. Kenneth's office door clicked open in the hallway behind the desk. His round, gray head peeked out, his brow furrowed in deep disapproval as his eyes scanned the screaming girl in the lobby. Maria stepped forward, her hand reaching through the counter opening to grab Eleni's wrist. Her fingers were cold, damp, and trembling. "Eleni, tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't do this. Mrs. Vardas's designer friend is already putting the pictures of the green arch on her social media as a joke. They are laughing at us, Eleni. They think we are peasants who can't even afford flowers." Eleni did not pull her hand away from her mother's grip. She let her wrist remain limp, her eyes moving calmly from her mother's face to her sister's. "The transfer was declined, Ma," Eleni said, her voice remaining in that flat, professional register. "The bank had insufficient funds. I told the florist we could not clear the balance today." "So you just let them sell my flowers?" Sophia's voice rose even higher, her chest heaving as she leaned over the counter, her face inches from the acrylic glass. "You didn't call Papa? You didn't use your own card? You did this on purpose. You've been planning this. You're just a bitter, jealous old maid who has nothing, and you want to ruin the only good thing that ever happened to this family." The waiting room was completely silent now. One of the patients, a retired postal worker with a neck brace, cleared his throat uncomfortably and looked down at his shoes. "Sophia, stop," Eleni said, her voice dropping another octave, becoming cold and quiet like the air in a cellar. "No, I won't stop," Sophia screamed, her eyes bright with tears of rage. "You are useless. You've always been useless. You sit at this stupid desk all day earning pennies, and you think you can control us because you write the checks? You're nothing. You're just a servant in our house, Eleni. If you don't fix this florist bill by Friday morning, if those hydrangeas aren't at the church on Saturday, don't you dare show your face at my wedding. Do you hear me? Don't you dare show up." Maria didn't defend Eleni. She didn't tell Sophia to stop. She simply stood there, her fingers still holding Eleni's wrist, her eyes searching Eleni's face with a silent, desperate demand that she make the embarrassment go away, no matter the cost to her own dignity. Dr. Kenneth stepped fully out of his office, his clipboard held against his chest. "Eleni, is there a problem here?" Eleni looked at Dr. Kenneth. She looked at his wrinkled, tired face, and then she looked at her sister, whose mouth was still twisted in a sneer of pure, spoiled entitlement. She felt a strange, light sensation in her chest, the feeling of a bird when the cage door is finally unlatched. She slowly slipped her wrist out of her mother's cold grip. She stood up, her dark blue scrub top falling neatly into place. "No, doctor," Eleni said to her boss, her voice clear, polite, and completely calm. "There is no problem. My family was just leaving." She walked around the side of the reception desk, her flat shoes silent on the carpet. She stood near the heavy glass front door, her hand resting on the brass handle. She pushed it open, letting in the cold, wet air of the street. "Go home, Ma," Eleni said, looking at her mother. "Go help Sophia with her dress." Sophia let out a loud, dramatic sob, turning her back to Eleni as she snatched her clutch from the counter. "You're dead to me, Eleni. You hear me? Dead. If you aren't there with the florist check on Friday, I'll tell everyone in the parish that you're too embarrassed to show up because you're old and alone." She stormed out of the clinic, her high heels clicking wildly on the wet concrete of the sidewalk. Maria paused near the door. She looked at Eleni, her mouth opening as if she wanted to say something, to offer some small, face-saving excuse. But Eleni's eyes were completely blank, two cold, dark pools of water that reflected nothing. Maria let out a short, defeated sigh and walked out into the rain, her black coat wet against her shoulders. Eleni closed the heavy door. The brass bell above it gave one last, quiet clink before going silent. She turned to the waiting room. The 3 elderly patients were staring at her, their faces filled with a quiet, embarrassed sympathy. "I'm very sorry for the interruption, gentlemen," Eleni said, her voice carrying a soft, professional warmth. "Mr. Miller, Dr. Kenneth is ready for you in Bay 1. She walked back behind her desk. She sat in her chair, picked up her stapler, and aligned the next patient sheet. She had just been banned from the wedding unless she paid. They had drawn the line in the concrete, in front of her employer and her patients, stripping away the last illusion of her sisterly duty. She reached into her pocket and touched the small metal key to her new apartment. The execution was no longer just a financial necessity, it was a moral certainty. The wet gravel of the driveway made a soft, crunching sound under Eleni's sneakers, like dry autumn leaves being crushed underfoot. It was Wednesday, 5:30 a.m. The sky was a dark, bruised violet, the morning mist hanging so thick and low over the street that the neighborhood street lamps were reduced to soft, blurry halos of orange light. Eleni carried her second bag, a faded green canvas duffel containing her old winter coats, 3 pairs of shoes, and her personal folders, to the trunk of her Honda Civic. She lifted the lid of the trunk, her fingers cold against the damp metal. She slid the green bag next to the black gym bag she had placed there on Sunday. There was only enough room left for one more small suitcase, which she would pack on Thursday night. She closed the trunk lid with a slow, controlled press of her palms, holding it down until the latch clicked shut with a muffled, metallic thunk. She didn't want the sound of a slamming trunk to bounce off the brick walls of the neighbors' houses in the early morning quiet. By 6 a.m., she was back in the kitchen, waiting for the water in the copper kettle to boil. The door to the hallway creaked open. Spiros walked in, his heavy flannel shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from another night of short, restless sleep. He didn't have his reading glasses on, and he walked with a slight, limping favor to his right knee. He didn't look at Eleni. He walked straight to the table, sat down on his usual chair, and reached into his pocket for his pack of cigarettes. He tapped one out against his thumbnail, lit it with a plastic lighter, and let out a long, heavy stream of blue smoke that rose toward the yellowed ceiling tiles. "Your mother told me about yesterday," Spiros said, his voice gravelly, dry as a throat full of dust. Eleni stood by the stove. The kettle was beginning to let out a thin, quiet hiss, not yet a whistle, but a soft, warm breath of steam. "Yes," she said. "Sophia is young," Spiros said, staring at the glowing orange tip of his cigarette. "She has her wedding in 3 days. Her head is spinning with all the details, the dress, the Vardis family. She speaks without thinking. You shouldn't take her words to heart." Eleni poured the hot water over her coffee filter. The dark liquid bubbled and hissed, the bitter scent of the grounds rising into the damp kitchen air. "I heard what she said, Papa," Eleni said quietly. "She's your sister," Spiros said, his voice hardening slightly, adopting that quiet, traditional authority that expected absolute obedience. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the flat, heavy certainty of a father who had spent 30 years making the decisions in his house. "In our family, we do not turn our backs on each other. If there is no money on the card, you must find another way. I talked to George again last night. He is going to give us the cash by Thursday afternoon. But we still need the final check for the reception hall by Friday morning. Mr. Pappas won't open the pavilion doors on Saturday unless the balance is cleared." He took a slow drag of his cigarette, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her through the smoke. "You have the clinic account. You can ask Dr. Kenneth for an advance. Or you can use your credit line. We will pay you back in July, Eleni. When the hotel pays the linen invoice, I will give you every dollar." Eleni looked at her father. She looked at his thick, purple-stained hands, the hands that had worked 40 years to build a reputation in a parish that didn't care about his debt, a parish that only cared about the gold foil on his younger daughter's invitations. He was not a monster. He was simply a man who had lived his entire life believing that Eleni's silence was a form of consent, that her labor was a natural resource he could mine whenever the well of his own finances ran dry. She made her final calculation. She knew that if she argued, if she told him about the apartment, if she told him that she had already decided to let the checks fail, he would scream, he would call his brother. They would find some other way to scrape the money together, and the wedding would go on, leaving Eleni trapped in the debt and the shame of their dynamic forever. So she chose the lie. "I'll handle the final checks on Friday, Papa," Eleni said, her voice calm, level, and entirely empty of any emotional strain. Spiros's shoulders relaxed, a deep, heavy sigh of relief passing through his chest. He tapped his cigarette ash into a small glass tray on the table. "Good. A good girl. I knew you wouldn't let your sister be humiliated. We are Giorgio. We look right to the community, no matter what." "I'll make sure everything is handled," Eleni said. She took her mug of coffee, walked out of the kitchen, and went back up the stairs to her bedroom. She stood by her window, watching the morning light slowly turn the gray mist into a bright, blinding fog. "I'll handle the final checks." It was the absolute truth, but not the truth Spiros had heard. On Friday morning, she would go to the bank. She would print the final stop payment confirmations. She would make sure that every single check she had post-dated for the Monday after the wedding was flagged in the clearinghouse system. She would cancel the authorized credit drafts for the caterer, the venue, and the floral company. She would let the wedding proceed on Saturday. She would let Sophia walk down the aisle under the bare green arch of carnations. She would let the guests sit at their beautiful ivory-clothed tables. And then, mid-reception, when the music was playing and the lamb was being served to the bishop at table 1, she would let the illusion dissolve. She took a slow sip of her coffee. It was hot, strong, and tasted of the cold morning air. 3 days left. The wardrobe was completely empty now. It was Thursday, 5:45 a.m. Eleni stood before the open closet doors. The bare wooden hangers hung from the metal rod like a row of thin, skeletal rids, rattling softly in the draft that always seeped through the floorboards. On her bed sat her third and final bag, a small, dark blue leather suitcase she had borrowed years ago and never returned. Inside, she had packed her remaining summer dresses, her toothbrush, a half-empty bottle of generic face wash, and a single, small framed photograph. The photograph was black and white, showing her grandmother as a young woman, standing on a dusty dirt road in her village, her hands folded over a dark apron, her eyes staring into the camera with that same quiet, unyielding stillness that Eleni had inherited. Eleni closed the suitcase. The metal latches shut with 2 sharp, heavy clicks that sounded incredibly loud in the dark, quiet room. She picked up the suitcase. It was lighter than the others. She carried it down the stairs, stepping carefully on the very edges of the wooden treads to avoid the creaky boards near the landing. Sophia's door remained shut, the soft, rhythmic sound of her white noise machine humming from the gap beneath the frame. Eleni walked out of the back door and stepped onto the damp concrete of the driveway. The morning air was thin and sharp, smelling of cold soil and wet pine needles. She unlocked the trunk of her Honda Civic. The space was tight now. She had to slide the dark blue suitcase horizontally, pushing it deep into the recess next to the green canvas duffel and the black gym bag. When she was finished, her entire life, every document, every piece of clothing, every memory she cared to keep was contained within a 3-foot-wide steel box at the rear of her car. She closed the trunk lid. It shut with a soft, clean thud. At 6:30 a.m., she sat at the kitchen table, a single mug of black coffee steaming in front of her. The door to the hallway opened, and Maria hurried in, her satin robe tied tightly around her waist, her face already tense with the frantic energy of the final 48 hours. She held a long, narrow strip of white paper, a printed list of urgent Thursday errands she had compiled on her phone. "George will be at the shop at noon," Maria said, setting the list directly on the table next to Eleni's coffee mug. She didn't look at Eleni. Her eyes were scanning the paper, her thumb running down the blue-inked lines. "He has the $1,500 in cash. He had to go to 3 different bank branches yesterday afternoon to get it, because the main branch in Astoria is having some kind of audit. Your father says you must go to the shop at 12, get the envelope from him, and take it straight to the florist." Eleni looked at the list. 1. Pick up cash from Papa, 12 p.m. 2. Deliver cash to Evergreen Floral Designs. 3. Pick up guest favor boxes from the printer in Queens. 4. Drop off the final table seating board at the Grand Pavilion, Mr. Pappas. "Sarah said she can still do the basic greenery and the white carnations for the church," Maria continued, her voice high and breathless. "But she needs the $1,500 cash in hand by 4 o'clock today, or she won't load the van tomorrow morning. She was very firm, Eleni. She said she doesn't trust our transfers anymore." Eleni picked up the white paper list. The paper was cheap, rough, and slightly damp from her mother's kitchen counters. She made her calculation. Uncle George. He was a kind, quiet man who spent 10 hours a day smelling of raw trout and ice shavings, his fingers permanently red and chapped from the cold waters of his display cases. The $1,500 he was lending Spiros was his personal property tax money. Money he had scraped together $50 at a time in a metal tin behind his counter. If she let Spiros take that money and give it to the florist, George would never see a single dollar of it back. Her father would make excuses, her mother would avoid his phone calls, and George's tax bill would go unpaid. "I'll go to the shop at noon, Ma," Eleni said quietly. "Good," Maria sighed, her hand going to her hair, her fingers smoothing down the loose strands near her temple. "Make sure you get the receipt from Sarah. A physical receipt, Eleni. Don't let her just write it on a scrap of paper. We cannot have any more mistakes." "I'll get the receipt," Eleni said. She stood up, took her coffee mug to the sink, and rinsed it out. She knew exactly what she would do at noon. She would drive to the dry cleaning shop. She would take the envelope with the $1,500 in cash from her father's purple-stained hands. But she would not drive to the florist. She would take that envelope, drive to her bank, and deposit the cash directly into her own private savings account. Then, on Monday morning, once her exit was complete and the wedding's financial facade had collapsed, she would execute a direct wire transfer for $1,500 back into Uncle George's personal account, accompanied by a quiet, anonymous text message letting him know his tax money was safe. She would not let her innocent uncle pay for her father's pride. She picked up her purse and her car keys from the hook by the door. "I'm leaving for the clinic, Ma," Eleni said. "Don't be late tonight," Maria called after her, her voice already moving back to the stovetop where the kettle was beginning to hiss. "Sophia's bridesmaids are coming over at 7 to pack the favor boxes. We need you to make the lemon water and clear the dining room." "I'll be there," Eleni said. She closed the screen door behind her, the light wooden frame shutting with a soft, double clack that sounded like a toy pistol firing in the quiet morning air. As she pulled out of the driveway, the Honda Civic's brakes let out that familiar, high-pitched shriek, but Eleni didn't feel the sting of embarrassment anymore. The noise was simply a mechanical countdown, a ticking clock that was growing louder and faster with every mile she drove toward her freedom. The air inside Spiros Quality Cleaners was exceptionally heavy on Thursday at noon. It was 12:10 p.m. The humidity from the high-pressure steam boiler in the basement had saturated the shop's narrow customer lobby, causing the paper calendar on the wall to curl at the edges. Eleni stood by the dark wooden counter, her fingers lightly touching the cold glass of the register display. Spiros was behind the assembly rack. He pulled a heavy wool winter coat off a hanger, inspected the lapels under the flickering fluorescent tube, and then reached into the deep drawer of his wooden desk. He pulled out a plain white envelope. It was unsealed, slightly crumpled, and had the name Spiros written across the front in Uncle George's thick, shaky handwriting. "He was here at 11, Spiros said, his voice dropping into a quiet, raspy register as he walked toward the counter. He handed the envelope to Eleni. His knuckles were stained a deep, permanent charcoal black from the dye of a batch of leather jackets he had recolored that morning. He came in through the back door. He didn't want the customers to see him carrying cash. "He's a good man, George," he said to tell Sophia that she must look like a queen on Saturday. Eleni took the envelope. It had a heavy, compact thickness in her hand. "I'll take it, Papa," she said, her voice calm and even. "Go straight to the florist," Spiros said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with his forearm. "Don't stop for lunch. Sarah said she needs the $1,500 cash before 4, or the delivery truck doesn't leave the warehouse tomorrow morning. If they don't load the greenery on Friday, the church will be empty on Saturday." "I'm going there now," Eleni said. She turned and walked out of the shop, the brass bell above the glass door letting out its sharp, cheerful chime. Outside, the midday sun was bright but cold, burning through the smog of the avenue. Eleni climbed into her Honda Civic, placed her purse on the passenger seat, and pulled the white envelope from her pocket. She slid her fingers inside and pulled out the cash. 15 bills, $100 each. They were old, soft, and smelled faintly of raw river water and wood smoke, the permanent odor of Uncle George's small fish market. Each bill had a dry, fibrous texture, their edges slightly frayed from being kept in George's kitchen tin. She counted them slowly, her thumb catching the corner of each bill. 1, 2, 3, 14, 15. She placed the bills back into the envelope and drove 3 blocks down the boulevard to the branch of her personal bank. It was a sterile, modern building with tall glass windows and a long, narrow drive-through lane that ran along the concrete retaining wall of the adjacent supermarket. Eleni bypassed the drive-through. She parked her car near the brick wall, grabbed her purse, and walked inside the quiet lobby. The air smelled of carpet cleaner and ozone. She walked to the automatic deposit terminal in the corner. She slid her debit card into the glowing green slot, entered her PIN, and selected the deposit cash option on the screen. The machine's shutter opened with a sharp plastic slide, revealing a dark, metal-rimmed tray. Eleni took the $1,500 from Uncle George's envelope. She placed the stack of 15 green bills into the tray. Clack! The shutter closed. Inside the machine, a high-speed roller began to count the bills, a rapid, rhythmic whirring sound that filled the quiet alcove. Chirp, 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 chirp. On the blue screen, the green numbers began to climb. Counting cash, 15 times $100. Total deposit, $1,500. Confirm? Eleni pressed the green button on the screen. Confirm. The machine let out one last mechanical sigh before spitting out a small white paper receipt. The card slot released her debit card with a soft click. Eleni took her card and her receipt. She looked at the paper. Transaction date, June 18, 2026, 12:22 p.m. Account balance, $1,612.15. She folded the receipt neatly and placed it in the zippered pocket of her purse, right next to her new apartment key. The money was safe. It was no longer a resource Spiros could use to buy his younger daughter's social peace. It was no longer a sacrifice George had to make to preserve his brother's pride. It was now a secure, untouchable asset sitting in Eleni's private account, waiting for Monday morning when she would wire it back to Astoria. She climbed back into her car and looked at the clock on her dashboard. It was 12:30 p.m. By 4 o'clock today, Sarah from Evergreen Floral Designs would realize that the $1,500 in cash had not arrived. The delivery truck would not be loaded on Friday morning. The dark greenery and the cheap white carnations would remain in the warehouse. On Saturday morning, when the church doors opened, there would be no arch. There would be no flowers on the altar. There would be only the cold, bare stone of the pillars. And Eleni would not be there to answer the phone. She shifted her car into first gear, her front brakes letting out one long, piercing shriek as she pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward her shift at the physical therapy clinic. The chandeliers of the Grand Pavilion cast a brilliant, fracturing light across the ivory damask tablecloths. It was Saturday, 8:15 p.m. The reception was in full swing. The three-piece band near the stage played a soft, slow waltz, the accordion and violin notes echoing off the high stone columns of the hall. But beneath the music, the air was heavy with a quiet, persistent whispering. There were no flowers. The tables, designed to hold massive, cascading arrangements of white hydrangeas, were bare, save for small, cheap glass bowls filled with cold water and 3 tight white carnations that looked lost in the vast expanse of the linen. The wedding arch near the head table was a naked wire frame, its raw green foam blocks exposed to the room, dotted with sparse salal leaves. Sophia's face was a rigid, frozen mask of desperation, her eyes fixed on her plate as Dimitri's aunt leaned across table 1 to whisper something to her husband. Eleni sat at table 12. She was positioned near the double swinging doors of the kitchen, where the scent of roasted garlic and dish detergent was strongest. She wore her plain charcoal gray wool dress, her bare ears catching the dim shadows of the service corridor. On her lap, beneath the heavy polyester napkin, her phone screen glowed faintly in the dark. The digital clock read 8:20 p.m. With her thumb, she navigated to her banking portal. The screen showed the pending transactions for the evening. Oasis Catering, final draft, $8,500. The Grand Pavilion, venue balance, $12,000. Queen's Fine Printing, services, $1,200. Below them was her personal checking account balance, which sat at exactly $112. Eleni's finger hovered over the red button on her screen. She felt no hesitation. She felt no sudden rush of heat or anger. Her heart beat with a slow, mechanical rhythm, perfectly synchronized with the ticking of the clock on the wall. She tapped the screen. Stop payment order authorized. Confirmation. Ref number 00994-C. Then she opened the merchant portal for the credit card. She selected the Report Unauthorized Activity option for the bar deposit draft, checking the box that read, Cancel all future merchant authorizations. The screen flashed once, then turned gray. Request submitted. All pending drafts have been frozen pending cardholder verification. Eleni slowly closed her phone, slipped it into her pocket, and folded her napkin neatly, placing it on the edge of the table. She stood up. No one at table 12 noticed. The videographer's assistant was busy checking his battery levels, and the elderly relatives were staring at the dance floor. Within 3 minutes, the first ripple began. The double swing doors of the kitchen flew open, and the catering supervisor, a tall man in a black vest, walked out, his face completely pale, his eyes wide as he stared at his handheld terminal. He walked straight to Mr. Pappas, the venue manager, who was standing near the bar. Mr. Pappas pulled his own phone from his jacket pocket. He looked at the screen, his forehead instantly creasing into deep, dark lines of alarm. The two men walked quickly toward the head table. They didn't wait for the music to pause. Mr. Pappas leaned down between Spiros and Maria, his voice carrying a sharp, urgent whisper that made Spiros's fork freeze midair. "What do you mean, stopped?" Spiros's gravelly voice broke through the music, rising in pitch as he tried to stand up, his chair scraping violently against the parquet floor. "There is a mistake. My daughter." "There is no mistake, Mr. Giorgio," Mr. Pappas said, his voice dropping into that cold, professional register that carried the weight of a legal threat. "The bank has just processed a stop payment order on the primary guarantor's checks. The credit card authorizations have been frozen. As of this moment, we have 0 cleared funds for this event." Sophia let out a short, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she looked at her father. "Papa? What is he saying?" "Stop the service," the catering supervisor called out, his hand raised toward the kitchen doors. Instantly, the waitstaff froze. A server who was about to place a plate of roasted lamb in front of Mrs. Helen Vardis stopped, pulled the plate back, and set it on his tray. Another server began walking down table 3, systematically picking up the half-eaten entrees and the silver-plated charger plates, stacking them with a loud, clattering clack, clack, clack that silenced the entire room. The band stopped playing. The violin let out a single dying squeak before going silent. "What are you doing?" Maria shrieked, her voice cracking as she stood up, her hand grasping her gold-plated necklace so tightly the clasp broke, the pearls scattering across the table like dry corn. "You cannot do this! The bishop is eating our guests!" "The contract stipulates that if the funds are not cleared by the start of the dinner, the services are terminated immediately," Mr. Pappas said, his face a cold, unyielding mask. "The venue doors will be locked in 15 minutes. I suggest you ask your guests to leave." The room was completely silent now, save for the rhythmic, humiliating sound of the kitchen staff stacking the dirty plates and rolling the linen carts across the floor. The guests sat in their expensive silks and tailored suits, staring in absolute horrified disbelief as the servers stripped the tables bare, leaving behind only the cheap glass bowls of carnations. Sophia looked toward table 12. Her face was twisted in a look of raw, venomous terror, her mouth open as she searched the back of the room for her sister. "Eleni!" Sophia screamed, her voice echoing off the high stone columns. "Eleni! Where are you? Fix this!" But table 12 was empty. Eleni was already standing in the dark gravel parking lot. The cool Saturday rain fell in a soft, steady drizzle, washing the smell of the venue's sweet lavender perfume from her skin. She climbed into her Honda Civic, turned the key, and listened to the engine rumble to life on the first crank. Her front brakes let out one last quiet shriek as she backed out of the drive-off circle, but she didn't look back at the grand glass dome of the pavilion. She drove through the quiet, mist-covered streets of the city. At 9 p.m., she unlocked the door to apartment 3B on 42nd Street. The room was small, bare, and silent. The radiator was cold, but the air was clean, smelling of fresh paint and old wood. She set her small blue suitcase on the floor, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet alleyway below, where the rain was forming tiny, perfect circles in the dark puddles. She sat on her small mattress. She felt a deep, immense, and beautiful quiet. She was finally alone. She had paid her debt. She had broken the mirrors of their vanity. and she had walked out of the theater before the final curtain could fall on her. Thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes, the heaviest sins are the ones we carry in silence, hidden behind the polished doors of our own homes, protected by the very people who claim to love us. If this story touched you, if you felt the chill of Eleni's silence and the cold weight of her final decision, we invite you to join us for more deep psychological journeys into the dark corners of domestic life. Subscribe to our channel, Sins Behind Family Doors, and never miss another dark, intimate confession. Turn on your notifications. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Eleni's choice, and remember, the quietest room in the house is often the one where the loudest secrets are kept. We will see you behind the next door.